From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 12, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Chris Jericho signs with WWF, ECW to air on TNN, tons more. By Dave Meltzer. In what was a huge signing, not only for its long-term repercussions but for what message it sends short-term about the future of both respective major U.S. organizations, Chris Jericho, inked a 3-year deal with Titan Sports on June 30th. Jericho, whose WCW contract expires on July 27th, technically has a 90-day non-compete clause in his WCW contract, but those non-compete clauses haven't been enforced in the past. Steve Regal, Paul White, because of the question as to whether they would stand up in court, and is expected to debut on WWF television in some form immediately after the contract expires. Titan immediately announced the signing on its website. Jericho still has a handful of house show dates remaining with WCW, but unless plans change, is not expected to appear on any telecasts per order of Eric Bischoff, who had made the decision not to use him on television unless he signed months ago. Signing Jericho had been considered the #1 personnel project of 1999 for Jim Ross. The Paul White deal had really been finalized more than 1 year earlier verbally, who handles contract negotiations for the WWF, particularly after Benoit, who was considered an equal or close second priority to Lure, decided to re-up with WCW. WWF getting Jericho continues the recent pattern of good news for WWF and bad news for WCW, at least when it comes to the wrestling aspect of the war. Irvine, 28, has been considered since he was allowed to carry the ball to a degree with his verbal skills by WCW in 1998, to be almost an unquestioned top player for the future. He's got the in-ring ability, the interview skills, and the look, with the only question being him being untested in the United States as a headliner, because WCW never gave him that chance, and the slight question of size, as he's smaller than most wrestlers Titan gives pushes to. Although slightly shorter, he's physically heavier than Shawn Michaels, who he has often been compared with, and was at a time Titan's biggest star. Irvine is a totally different performer. He's not in Michaels' league in the ring, nor all but a handful in the history of the industry. He's considerably funnier and better on the mic, although Michaels made up for that with stage presence and his ability to have on occasion unbelievable matches. In match quality of his pay-per-view matches over the past 3 years since competing as a regular with WCW, Jericho was number 8 among wrestlers who regularly compete in North America in both 1998 and 1997, after finishing number 10 in 1996, which puts him at the elite level when it comes to performing in the ring. Only 3 North American wrestlers finished better in that regard than him all 3 of those years: Rey Mysterio Jr., Ultimo Dragon, and Eddie Guerrero. Shawn Michaels, Malenko, Chris Benoit, Bret Hart, and Mick Foley finished ahead of him 2 of those 3 years, but that also shows the class of talent he'd be in comparison with. He was not wrestling at that level this year, where he was being buried from the start, first with a program with Perry Saturn early in the year, then no program at all. Combining his ring performance ability with finishing 3rd in last year's Observer poll for Best on Interviews and 5th for Most Charismatic Wrestler, should have groomed him at his age for being a main eventer, barring injury, for the next decade, and showed he was already at the least 1 year overdue from a push to that level. But in what may wind up, like with Steve Austin, as one of the black marks on Eric Bischoff's managerial career, he hit the famous glass ceiling when he started getting over through his verbal skills, and then, because he didn't sign his deal, was buried for virtually all of 1999 after a proposed program with Bill Goldberg in late 1998 was cut off almost before it started by Goldberg, who was being influenced by Kevin Nash to nix it because of Jericho's size. There was a legitimate thought that Jericho's entertainment value on interviews, because he was funny, while a strong part of a 3-hour telecast, didn't translate into main event level heat and seriousness, but that's a question that can never be fairly addressed because he was never put in position. WCW officials seemed far too wishy-washy, despite many acknowledging his potential, and even before Jericho made his own decision, the company almost pushed him to the opposition by its treatment of him this year as compared with other wrestlers whose deals were expiring. Another negative for him in his decision-making was the career direction of Benoit and Malenko, 2 of his best friends in the company, who had been promised big pushes if they resigned. and are both still at basically the same level, and more are having things said about them to the extent that they don't have the potential due to size, charisma, or interview skill to go farther, a question that can't be answered conclusively since they also never got the chance. In recent months, his name was ordered never talked about on television, and signs fans brought to television tapings with his name on them were confiscated. Despite that, even up to the last several days before the signing, WCW officials were hopeful they were still in the hunt, and even Jericho professed to have not completely made up his mind, with WCW's actions and directions combined with Ross and Titans pursuing him hard, if anything, seemingly made him lean toward WWF. Several WCW wrestlers noted that the company had offered huge raises and big contracts to newcomers and celebrities but did not come forth with the offer Jericho couldn't have afforded to turn down. All that is known about Jericho's contract with Titan is that it is heavily incentive-based with a lower downside guarantee than WCW was offering, but a higher potential if he gets a strong push. It is believed WCW's most tangible offer was only in the $425,000 to $500,000 per year range, meaning the company wasn't offering him superstar money, and most likely without it, they had no need to push him to justify a superstar salary, which is how so many of the big names now keep their position. Those close to him indicate Eric Bischoff's reaction was he could stay or go, and Bischoff didn't ever act like it was a big deal either way, with the only thing offered him was a spot in the old versus new angle. Without question, Titan's reputation, which has been enhanced greatly over the past 12 months, for its ability to create new stars and not rely on stars long in the tooth, made it the place to go for career enhancement. The fact WCW didn't get serious in negotiations, which some have attributed to Bischoff being mad at Jericho personally because at one point he felt they had agreed to a deal verbally months back and Jericho didn't sign, until the very end, may turn out to be a key story 5 years from now when the final chapter is written about the period WCW actually was for a short term the global leader in the industry, only to piss it away by lack of management foresight. Irvine, the son of former NHL star Ted Irvine, grew up in Winnipeg and debuted at the age of 19 in 1990 wrestling and training out of Calgary after the death of Stampede Wrestling. He trained from the start with current ECW wrestler Lance Evers, Storm, and first gained some notice wrestling out of Winnipeg with Storm as part of a tag team called Sudden Impact for Tony Condello. He eventually gained international notoriety wrestling as Lionheart and later Lion Do for the War promotion in Japan and as Corazon de Leon, which is Spanish for Lionheart, or EMLL in Mexico, where he had many good and a few incredible matches with Ultimo Dragon over the NWA middleweight title. The tape of his best match with Dragon, on July 7, 1995 in Tokyo, was directly responsible for getting his job with ECW. After spending a few months with ECW, he signed with WCW in 1996 after Bischoff saw him wrestle live at Antonio Inoki's World Wrestling Peace Festival in Los Angeles. His signing and tenure with WCW are almost apropos of exactly how the company got where it was, why it didn't stay there, and why WWF passed them by. In 1996, Bischoff was scouring the world to sign the best young talent no matter where they lived, while Titan was literally asleep at the wheel trying in vain to push big slow guys because that's what wrestling used to be. This paid Bischoff big dividends at the time, but Bischoff was unwilling to complete the advantage by mixing the younger talent to his aging crew of largely 80s headliners. By falling asleep at the wheel himself trying to push older guys who were losing appeal because those guys were what wrestling used to be, it was WWF that became more aggressive in creating and pushing new talent the past 2 years, which has also paid big dividends, and now Bischoff's World All-Star class of 1996 has either been destroyed by being portrayed for far too long as underneath talent, La Parca, Juventud Guerrera, Psicosis, etc., or fallen into mid-card level for so long their upward mobility has been hurt by the perception. Benoit, Malenko, Guerrero, Jericho, who may have been the most marketable of all of them, in the wake of all this, has been lost. Bischoff had originally been alerted to him both on the recommendation of Benoit and by promoter Zane Breslov after seeing his match with Benoit at the second Super J Cup in Japan. As noted last week, the Nashville network made the official announcement on June 30th of the ECW deal for a Friday night time slot, running it as part of a Friday night action sports block that will include roller jam, rodeo, and demolition derbies. Although announced as starting on August 27th, the ECW presence will actually first be felt on August 13th with a 1-hour history of ECW introduction show, followed on August 20th by another 1-hour show introducing the current characters and storylines before the August 27th official premiere. The first TNN show is scheduled to be taped on August 6th at press time in Birmingham, Alabama at Boutwell Auditorium, although there are strong internal thoughts to moving the first taping site to a larger city, with Cleveland as the most likely alternative, in a decision that will almost definitely have to be made this week. Most of the TNN tapings will be in more major league-looking buildings with far stronger production than ECW has done up to this point. There will be exceptions, as most likely either the second or third TNN show will be taped on August 26th at the 900-seat Elks Club in Queens, New York, and Heyman for historical reasons wants to do one taping at the ECW arena. Noting that the shows will be taped as much as 3 weeks prior to airtime shows that Paul Heyman will have a new challenge ahead of him when it comes to detailed long-term planning, the same challenge that caused major problems in WCW when they were unable to keep their own storylines straight when situations caused them to tape some shows out of sequence. Berg will serve as senior producer of the show. Berg was producer of Monday Nitro 1995 to 1997, and of WCW pay-per-view events 1993 to 1997, and had produced the series Motor Madness for TNN on Friday nights, which used Dusty Rhodes as a commentator. As mentioned last week, ECW will be paying for production of the show. TNN will keep most of the commercial time and also receive a percentage of any increase in any form of ECW business above the estimated $11 million the company generated last year from all revenue streams. While it was mentioned last week that ECW's September 19th pay-per-view, which will be called ECW Anarchy Rules, scheduled for the Odeum Theatre in Villa Park, Illinois, will be its first in Canada, that deal, according to Viewers' Choice Canada, is not finalized but is said to be a high priority of VC Canada to put together. TNN gives ECW its first television exposure into Canada. The contract ECW signed gives TNN the option to increase the show to 2 hours, which isn't likely to be considered unless TNN drops Roller Jam. The company has invested millions in its Roller Derby revival, which didn't make it, and at least part of the reason they were so hot on going into wrestling, something the network had avoided since its inception, was the feeling it would serve as a strong lead-in. Few believe that theory will work in practice. It was the same old story for World Championship Wrestling, a show that started out with a lot of promise and enthusiasm and hit a low note early and largely stayed there for most of its 3 hours on its long-awaited July 5th Atlanta, Georgia Dome event. The show included the return to WCW television of both Bret Hart and Bill Goldberg, both to huge fan reactions. But Hart was clearly still confused and undecided about his future, which played into the proposed angle, but also had a lot more than a tinge of reality to it. Due to its timing on the show, with the interview starting a few minutes before the hour when Raw was to begin, it came off as a typical wrestling ratings ploy and using someone's genuine emotion to keep the audience from changing channels, no different than how WWF handled the same Owen Hart death situation. Because of the holiday, at press time it was unclear how much, if any, Hart's return to television being placed before Raw started with a Steve Austin interview and confrontation with Vince McMahon affected the quarter-hour ratings. What was expected is that the positioning of the rock band Megadeth in the final quarter hour of the show, head-to-head with the beginning of a Rock vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley cage match, likely resulted in a lot of channel switching and the vast majority of the wrestling audience thus missing Goldberg's return. The live Georgia Dome event drew 25,338 fans, which was 19,456 paying $594,745. Some within the company tried to blame the crowd. The smallest WCW has drawn in that building, which was set up for 44,368 seats, on it being held on a holiday weekend. But it's clearly a good crowd at this stage in the game for a company that is falling fast in popularity, epitomized greatly by this show. The key item on the show, at least as far as the anchor position on the show, was Megadeth singing a song they recorded for the soon-to-be-released Universal Soldier 2 movie, which Goldberg is the co-star in, followed by the WCW title match with Kevin Nash vs. Sid Vicious. But from a crowd reaction standpoint, it was the return of Goldberg and Hart that popped the biggest reactions, with Goldberg's return being unannounced and creating so much enthusiasm that it literally killed the main event and post-match angle. The irony about the Goldberg return was that WCW debuted a new pizza commercial with Goldberg and Meng that ran all over the television show before his return. Hart, in his first WCW appearance since the death of Brother Owen, followed what was easily the high point of either show, a tremendous video on Bret, talking about his career and the death of Owen, put together and narrated by Mike Tenay. The video got a huge ovation live from the Georgia Dome crowd, which is the first time such a reaction was ever given at a Nitro to a video. This set the stage for Hart's return. According to those live, the reaction was very strong, although WCW has had problems with crowd micing and this show was no exception and it wasn't as impressive on television. But Hart was clearly not ready to be put in front of the public to talk about his own career. He was said to be on the verge of tears several times in the locker room before going out, and still looked like someone who had not yet recovered from losing a close family member. The crowd, at least the vast majority, was very supportive of him, aside from a few noticeable catcalls when he couldn't talk. This was far from Ric Flair's return in Greenville as a wonderful television moment. It's unfair to expect that this is what it would be. While the angle was for Hart to leave his future in question, one could tell angle or not, he was wrestling with that very question with a national audience watching him, and was clearly distraught about his own career, trying to tie the recent retirements of John Elway and Wayne Gretzky and their spectacular send-offs to his career possibly ending in a burning flame after an injury and politically plagued year, capped off by a personal tragedy. There were moments where he was visibly shaking. The crowd booed when he teased he might not come back, and the only time, except for the catcallers, gave the reaction of not wanting to deal with the harsh reality of and in their entertainment only when Hart mentioned that his family lived for wrestling, and now had died for it. The interview ended without a crescendo or much of anything, as he simply walked out of the ring thanking fans and fellow wrestlers, and he didn't have anything else to say, with a tear in his eye, and was very shaken backstage. The crowd, politely, gave him a standing ovation when he left. Even though he may be having second thoughts, when push comes to shove, it is expected Hart will come back for his proposed program with Hulk Hogan, the first match of which would probably be either the October 24th Havoc pay-per-view from Las Vegas or the November 22nd World War III pay-per-view from Toronto. Hart, Hogan and Bischoff met in Chicago on June 30th to go over plans, which would lead to Hogan returning to television in August and Hart returning as a full-time television performer in September to build up a series of matches. The original idea was for their program to lead to a three-way program involving Goldberg, but at this point it doesn't appear Goldberg will be involved in the program. Hart is said to be internally confused at this point at how reacting strongly in an angle as a babyface to get revenge for anything a heel did to him wouldn't come across as being trivial and couldn't be taken seriously in context. The show's ending was the most criticized of all, a title match which went all of 126 before the run-ins. The crowd was chanting Goldberg, since he'd shown up minutes earlier, rather than paying attention to the match. When Savage did his run-in, it elicited more Goldberg chants. When NWO Sting ran out, literally nobody reacted, as the past week of the announcers trying to lead fans into believing Jeff Farmer's actions were those of Sting's weren't bought by anyone, which only made Kevin Nash booking himself to look as lame as the announcers and the company when he bought into them. The real Sting made the save, but the show in the ring ended with Nash giving the real Sting a powerbomb after he had saved him. Backstage, Savage threatened Tori Wilson, and even gave her a slap, who noticeably laughed, playing the role and ruining the scene. Even worse was Savage confronting Gorgeous George, ripping her Nash t-shirt off, and literally throwing her across the room. While men beating on women, a former wrestling taboo, has been shattered frequently by both ECW and WWF, and this broke no new ground. WCW comes off looking worst of all for publicly trying to take this moral high ground, and in reality between the questionable language and violence against women on this show and portrayal of women as possessions to be bought, sold, bet on and traded. This is not a knock on copying a successful direction, because for better or for worse, all numbers indicate that is what the public wants from wrestling today. Until someone comes up with a different concept that works, everyone is going to copy this one, but it's a major knock on a company being so critical of the direction, and then doing close to the same thing. Within the United States, for a variety of reasons, television ratings have come under more scrutiny and been given more importance in recent years than at any time in the history of the industry. While today's Raw ratings are actually just about identical to what Georgia Championship Wrestling was doing in 1981, far more homes are hooked to cable today, so there is a much larger audience and there is more competition today for that audience. But the percentage of available audience watching GCW then, before it was a big media deal, is the same as watches Raw today. They mean so much more because until 1995, pro wrestling ratings weren't treated as anything important. Television sold the product. Ratings were important largely because the bigger the audience viewing the television, the larger the audience you could sell your product to. But, and this can be pointed out in any long-term study of the business, there was no statistical correlation in the past between television ratings to arena attendance and pay-per-view buys, which brought in the revenue in those days that carried the business. Today, the television is the product. The house shows are a profitable part of the business, but they lag way behind television, pay-per-view and licensing when it comes to importance and revenue garnered. In the WWF, house show are important to the wrestlers because they are paid on this strange magically known formula supposedly based on, primarily, house show gates. Ratings, like all numbers in wrestling, are often misconstrued, exaggerated and outright lied about. But it's no lie that ratings have turned around big time over the past year, at a time when WCW was still ahead overall, although it had begun to be a competitive race on Monday nights with WWF on the verge of taking over the lead. At this point, Raw routinely comes close to, and often does double the ratings of Nitro. Heat, which wasn't around last year, generally draws a full point better than Thunder. Come September, the game which be shaken up even more. SmackDown should destroy Thunder, and there's a wild card if ECW's debut on TNN can establish the company as a significant ratings producer, and what type of audience makeup it will actually draw. What we're going to do here is compare how the ratings for the various cable shows have changed over the past year. We're comparing the second quarter, April through June, from 1999 with that of 1998, with the exception of Nitro, in which we'll compare the second quarter of 1999 with the first quarter of 1998, because the second quarter in 1998 was artificially low because Nitro ran several weeks out of its time slot and drew poor numbers. This year there was one preemption, which doesn't work against the average, but every other week the show ran 3 hours in its regular time slot. If anything, when the comparisons of Raw are listed, these improvements shown, while really impressive, are actually artificially low because last year Raw ran 3 of the 13 weeks in the second quarter unopposed because Nitro was in a different time slot due to basketball. This year Raw only ran once unopposed. For Japan, we don't have any demographic information available, so comparing the ratings for All Japan and New Japan so far in 1999 is pretty straightforward. All Japan went from a 3.26 average rating for the first 6 months of last year to a 4.50, which is a very strong 38% increase for what on paper is a stale promotion. It says something for the ratings power in 1999 of just putting on great wrestling matches. The increase in February can be attributed to the aftermath of the death of Giant Baba, but months later the numbers are still strongly up over the past several years, even though house show business isn't up. New Japan went from a 2.52 average up to a 3.56, or a 41% increase for a more angle-related product, but still with a strong in-ring product. Considering the time slots these shows run, those kind of increases seems to indicate that even though the live gates may not show increases of that level, some of that can be pointed to Japan's economy being in such poor shape because the ratings show a huge increase in the casual audience of Japanese wrestling, which with increases of that level, kind of contradicts that two guys exchanging holds in their underwear is boring to the general public in 1999 theory, and more points to the fact that simply correctly done compelling wrestling, when a concept is done correctly and it matters more done correctly with money or credibility behind it than what the concept itself is, still works today. For comparison, comparing the first 6 months of last year to this year in the United States, Raw is up 52%, Livewire is up 26%, Superstars is up 10%, Nitro is down 5%, somewhat misleading because last year's number includes several shows that did poor ratings because they were moved to afternoon time slots, so factoring that out it's realistically down 15%, much of which should be attributed to the popularity of Raw. Thunder is down 13%, without any competition. That has to be attributed to the people watching it losing interest in the promotion combined with show being so bad, and WCW Saturday Night is down 9%. The reality of reality, both the reality of reality in the ring and reality of business, reared its sometimes ugly head on several fronts at Dream Stage Entertainment's Pride 6 show, a Japan-only live pay-per-view event under rules very similar to UFC, on July 4th, at the Yokohama Arena. DSE's biggest drawing card, pro wrestling legend Nobuhiko Takada, was put into the ring with Mark Kerr, who many feel is the best heavyweight at this in the world. It didn't last long, with Kerr overpowering Takada, winning with a chicken wing armlock in 3:04 before a crowd of 12,580, said to be a legitimate figure, which is really impressive for a shoot show, a lot attributed to Ogawa's debut with the company. The fact DSE put Takada, 37, into that position with a fighter that nobody on the inside would have given him any chance with but not a so-called legendary Gracie, says something about their plans for the future, if they even have any, and in particular their feelings about Takada's drawing power long term. There were some reports with the feeling that Kerr took it easy on Takada before beating him. Still, this result and the ease that Kerr won apparently severely damaged Takada's reputation even among the wrestling fans. There seems to be the sense that Takada was put in this position partially as punishment for his refusing to job for Ogawa in what was originally the idea to main event this show. There are also reports that on June 24th, Antonio Inoki had a meeting with New Japan officials and got Takada pulled from the August 28th Jingu Stadium show for the same reason, where it had been talked that he would face Shinya Hashimoto the next day at the New Japan show. Officials talked about the printed rumors of such a match on the show and blamed the press for leaking them out before the deal was finalized, and that because of that, negotiations fell through. Takada headlined the two biggest shows of this promotion, both on October 11th of 1997 and 1998 respectively, losing to Rickson Gracie. He was also given bought and paid for wins on Pride shows, including most recently against UFC star Mark Coleman, a sometimes training partner of Kerr's. After his loss to Kerr, in his post-match press conference he said he'd like to face Royce Gracie, but the marketability of such a match was said to be damaged greatly. The next show is scheduled for September 12th at the same Yokohama arena with largely the same cast of characters. Perhaps the idea is that Takada was going back to pro wrestling anyway and had to be so protected that to insiders he had become an embarrassing joke to the company, so they just let natural law take its course. Now the company seems to be protecting another pro wrestler, Naoya Ogawa, either grooming him as the big heavyweight drawing card if they survive, or protecting him for pro wrestling if they don't. Ogawa is much bigger, younger at 31, a better legitimate competitive athlete, witness his impressive judo credentials, and has the backing of the Antonio Inoki manipulation machine. Bottom line is there was too much money at stake to risk Ogawa losing, because a loss would greatly damage the proposed New Japan October Tokyo Dome main event, which may be on October 11th, in the grudge match with Hashimoto. Ogawa on this show defeated Gary Goodridge at 36 seconds of the second 10 minutes round when the referee stopped the match that was said to be the most exciting on the show. Very strong indications are this was a worked match, which would explain why it was so exciting. It is generally regarded as such already in the inside martial arts world. We should have a full report probably next week after seeing the tape. It was a mixed bag for the pro wrestlers on this show, with the biggest name lighter weight pro wrestler, Kazushi Sakuraba, remaining unbeaten within his weight class. He lost a match to Kimo, who was probably 60 pounds heavier, many years back, beating Ebenezer Fontes Braga of Brazil in 925 with an armbar. This appears to set up Sakuraba, who weighing just 185 pounds won a UFC heavyweight tournament at UFC Japan in late 1997, to face Frank Shamrock, which would be legitimately the toughest test probably both men have ever faced at least under these rules in their careers. Shamrock was at the show and mentioned wanting to face Sakuraba Henson Inoue, who Shamrock defeated in an almost legendary match in November of 1997, and Akira Shoji, who defeated Shamrock's one-time Lions Den stablemate Guy Mesger in a very close decision that a lot of people felt Mesger won earlier in the show. Shamrock had been in negotiations again of late with UFC and had verbally agreed to defend his middleweight title against Tito Ortiz on the September 25th show in Montreal. UFC remains pretty insistent on him signing an exclusive deal, and there was talk that Shamrock appearing at the Pride show could result in the September 25th match with Ortiz being cancelled and Shamrock being stripped of his title. It appears if Shamrock does a match with Pride, it likely means he'll be stripped of his title and it will constitute the official break of the relationship, but at press time Shamrock talked with Semaphore Entertainment Group officials upon returning from Japan and said he was still looking to face Ortiz. At this point in time, losing another star due to insistence on exclusivity on a show lacking stars may not be the best for business. But the reality of the show is fights under this style with evenly matched up opponents are often slow-moving and end without decisive finishes, making for long shows. This 8-match show lasted 4.5 hours, with the first 5 matches all going the time limit, which, according to our reports, were for the most part but not all boring matches. Overall it was considered the best Pride show to date. Pride has, for the most part, the best high-profile match booking in the mixed martial arts world, but its shows have all been major disappointments because of problems inherent with even matches held in rings as opposed to cages, and lack of stand-ups when stalemates take place on the ground. The fact Pride has worked matches has tainted the shows to purists, but it's that manipulation that has kept people with drawing power like Takada and Ogawa strong, and the worked matches have, since they are worked, generally gotten a far more enthusiastic crowd reaction than the true shoots, since it's still the pro wrestling audience that supports the shows, even if it renders the end results meaningless and the legitimacy of the operation as a whole questionable when judged from a sports perspective. 1. Carl Malenko, Carl Ogbibena, who formerly did pro wrestling for Battlerts under the name Carl Greco, scored a major upset winning a unanimous decision over Egan Inoue after 25 minutes. Greco managed to take Inoue, a big name in the world of jiu-jitsu, down and hold him there for most of the match en route to winning a unanimous decision. This was a big win for the Japanese pro wrestling world and Battlerts group, coming on the heels of Alexander Otsuka's upset of Marco Ruiz. 2. Carlos Newton won a unanimous decision after 25 minutes over Daijiro Matsui, a Takada protege who had done pro wrestling for the Kingdom promotion and fought many times in this competition under the name Shunsuke Matsui. Daijiro is his real first name. This was said to have been fairly exciting for a long match. 3. Igor Vovchanchyn of Russia won a split decision over Carlos Barreto after 25 minutes. The crowd was heavily booing the lack of action in this match. I presume Vovchanchyn, a kickboxer by background, wanted to slug and Barado, with his jiu-jitsu background, was reluctant and defensive and apparently made for a poor fight. 4. Hiroki Kurosawa drew Nobuaki Kakuta over 2 3-minute rounds under full-contact kickboxing rules in a match where both fought with gis. Kakuta is best known in Japan as a sometimes fighter and oftentimes ref for the K1 promotion. Full-contact rules eliminate leg kicks, which meant the match was geared toward Kurosawa's sport than Kakuta's. 5. In something of an upset, Akira Shoji won a split decision over Guy Mezger after 25 minutes. Mezger, well known in Japan as a former king of Pancrase, apparently fought hard with Shoji for the distance. Our initial reports were that this was a very close fight that could have gone either way. Pride was actually hoping for Mezger to win this match to build him up for a match with Sakuraba. 6. Ogawa, in his first MMA fight, beat Goodridge. When the bell rang, Goodridge exploded with hard punches but Ogawa stayed up. Ogawa responded with punches. Goodridge scored a takedown and a mount, going for a leg lock. Ogawa reversed him and mounted him, punching from the top many times and going for an armbar and keeping the mount during the remainder of the first round. In the second round, Goodridge again started throwing punches, but Ogawa timed him, took him down, threw some more punches from the mount and grabbed the armbar and the ref stopped the match. Ogawa ran around the ring doing his bird motion that he did in the Hashimoto match and held up his NWA title belt. After the match, Ogawa said that he wasn't interested in a match against Takada. 7. Sakuraba beat Braga with the armbar. Braga gained a reputation in Japan since he went to a draw, with no judges, but that had there been judges he'd have won, against Masakatsu Funaki, who has a big name in Japan, on the April Pancrase pay-per-view show. The crowd got really into this show seeing pro wrestlers Ogawa and Sakuraba score clean wins in succession. The Fat Shamrock was there to issue the challenge lends some suspicion, but Sakuraba, coming off handing Vitor Belfort an embarrassing defeat, is also as highly regarded a fighter as there is of his size. The loss may result in Braga being pulled from the July 16th UFC show as the company wasn't happy about him doing this match to begin with. At press time, no replacement had been found and Braga indicated that he still wanted to be in the show for his scheduled match with Paul Jones. 8. Kerr beat Takada with the chicken wing armlock. Takada had his elbow and shoulder heavily taped going in. This probably sets up Kerr, who is unbeaten in MMA, against Enson Inoue, coming off a 90-second submission win in October against former UFC heavyweight champion Randy Couture. Kerr Inoue is a match Pride has put together twice but has fallen through when each respectively had gotten injured in training. Due to the holiday weekend, no ratings are available for the Monday night and weekend programming. For June 28th, the gap wasn't quite record-breaking, but it was still a 2-1 slaughter in favor of Raw, which drew its second highest rating ever for a competitive situation with a 6.82 rating, 6.41 first hour, 7.19 seconds hour, paced by yet another Steve Austin title win on Raw, and an amazing 11.2 share, trailing only the 7.14 rating for the Owen Hart tribute show. Nitro in opposition drew a 3.59 rating, 3.94 first hour, 3.20 seconds hour, 3.63 third hour, and a 6.0 share. A small part of Raw's number was that it went 8 minutes unopposed at the end of the show, or more than half of the Austin Undertaker title change, which, after Nitro went off the air, drew an amazing 9.5 rating and 17.1 share, making it the most watched match in cable television history. It became the first match in cable television wrestling history ever to break the 7 million homes, 7,215,000 for the final 5 minutes, and 10 million viewers, 10,721,000 mark. Had Nitro not handed Raw the 8 minutes free at the end, Raw still would have had its 5th highest as opposed to 2nd highest ever rating. Nitro, with a headline match/angle involving Kevin Nash versus David Flair and basically every top heel in the company involved, due to a timing problem of ending the match too soon and going to the angle too soon, went off the air with the planned final scene, the reflection of Jeff Farmer, New Japan's NWO Sting, in the mirror to make people think Sting was the Humvee driver. At 10:57 p.m. the show has been scheduled to end at 11 p.m. Raw went 5 extra minutes past the hour, picking up a huge audience for its angle to end the show every week now, while Nitro appears to have given up on going longer as another sign of a company that has in many ways figuratively thrown in the towel without quite admitting it. Over the head-to-head 1 hour and 57 minutes, Raw drew a 6.64 rating to Nitro's 3.41. Nitro's rating was up from the past few weeks, and it was largely due to the build-up of the Nash vs. David Flair match. Apparently, with everyone at ringside, Fans expected something newsworthy to take place, and it did a 4.44 12-minute block. It has been reported almost everywhere that it did a 4.4 quarter, but the actual final quarter rating was 3.76 because the show went off early and combat started early because of the timing snafu. The match/angle actually hurt the WWF head-to-head slightly, as the final quarter, which included the dreaded USA News segment and the beginning of Undertaker Austin, did a 6.5 for the 12 minutes and a 7.06 for the quarter, with the 3 big unopposed minutes at the end. It would be unfair to say the Nash-David Flair match was competitive with Austin Undertaker's title switch, but it was more competitive than anything WCW has done in the past several weeks, and it was going against Austin challenging for the title, which is WWF's biggest card it can throw out. The actual quarter-hour peak for Raw was the prior segment at 7.34 for the Ivory Angle and the Jarrett vs. X-Pac match. In other words, another high ratings mark for Deborah, which beat Nitro's Sid Vicious vs. Scott Putski handily at 3.31. The only other rating available at press time was Thunder for July 1st, which drew a 2.70 rating and 4.5 share, which would be the second lowest rating in its history for a regular time slot show, trailing only the week with the SmackDown special head-to-head, coming off a little bit of an increase the previous week. The rating was a huge disappointment because there were thoughts, since Thunder has been doing about the same as Nitro, that doing a show-long angle with Nash and Savage, who are usually not even on Thunder, would help things and possibly lead to Thunder becoming WCW's highest-rated show of the week, at least until SmackDown starts, since that will end up killing the show unless the show itself is revamped. But with the double top billings being Rey Mysterio Jr. against nobody, they didn't acknowledge Blitzkrieg, another young guy loaded with talent that has no credibility since they never push him, as his opponent. And of course they had a really good match, but it meant nothing because it had no context or hype coming in or going out, until late in the show, and Rick Steiner vs. Bagwell, complete with David Flair illogically having the stun gun back even though Nash took it on Thursday. The show only peaked at 3.2 ratings. The Thunder replay did a 1.2. It should also be noted that the June 28th replay of Happy Hour with Val Venus and Ryan Shamrock did a 3.1 rating, which is way up from the usual 2.0 level the show does without a wrestling guest. The audience dwindled majorly as the show went on, since it got the great Raw lead-in, and the Happy Hour show is awful, but for that time slot it's considered a great rating for cable, since Crusade on TNT after Nitro only did in 0.8 head-to-head. Japanese television rundown. June 20th, All Japan. 1. Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori beat Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao in 1606 from Budokan Hall. The second half of the match aired. It was a lot better than you'd think because Kawada literally beat the hell out of Takayama. The crowd was into it really big because of the stiffness, and Takayama gave some stiff stuff back as well. Takayama does have this willingness to take a great beating in a big match, which on rare occasions does overcome the fact he's a terrible worker. When Tao tagged in, they were all over the place, but it was still stiff enough that the crowd was into it. The finish saw Omori and Takayama do a double-team powerbomb on Kawada, then take over on Tao with Omori using his axe bomber, Takayama a leg drop, Omori his bombs away knee drop, and Takayama a second leg drop, all in succession for the surprise pin. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Johnny Ace and Bart Gunn won the double tag titles from Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama in 1936. Again, the second half of the match aired. This was an interesting match because it was laid out like a typical great All Japan tag title match with the complicated stiff spots and building to the big finish. It did work with the crowd as the heat was really strong at the end for the near falls. But in other ways it was bad, since Ace tries all the complicated spots but doesn't look good doing them, and Gunn has little in the way of charisma, can't sell well, and his offense consists largely of just body blows, which thankfully for him, in Japan because of his Brawl for All rep, means something. Ace used his Ace Crusher several times as it's a guaranteed pop move. He did it on the floor on Kobashi. He teased doing another off the apron, but Akiyama blocked him. Gunn used a KO head punch on Kobashi for a big spot, and Ace did an Ace Crusher on Akiyama for a near fall. Ace's stuff was looking really bad, but the crowd was into it big by this point anyway. Another Ace Crusher on Akiyama followed by Gunn coming off the top rope with a leg drop, which didn't look that good either, but the crowd popped huge when Akiyama kicked out. Ace and Gunn then did a double team Ace Crusher followed by a Thunderfire power bomb, but Kobashi saved. Finally, Ace delivered a Cobra Clutch suplex, dropping Akiyama on his head for the pin. The moves make the match sound a lot better than it was. 2 3/4 stars. 3. Akiyama pinned Ace in 320 from Budokan Hall, which was the revenge for the tag title match. This was a hot short match with Ace delivering an Ace Crusher in the ring and on the floor right away. Akiyama came back with his exploder and a Dr. Bomb, followed by another exploder for a near fall. This was good on a lot of levels because Budokan fans aren't used to matches ending before 15 minutes, so they don't get into the big moves early because they don't believe them, but these guys worked such a hot pace early the fans were really into it. Finish saw Akiyama come off the top and Ace met him with a dropkick, which actually didn't look bad, but Akiyama came back with a Hurricane Rana for the pin. 2.5 stars. June 27th, All Japan. 1. Yoshinari Ogawa retained the PWF Junior title, pinning Kentaro Shiga in 2031. Only the last 5 minutes aired. The match seemed close to great during that time and the crowd was very much into it. They loved Shiga as an underdog and were into his near falls hoping for the upset. Shiga's tornado DDT is really over, so he did one, then did a really cool move when he came off the ropes and caught Ogawa in midair and turned it into the swinging DDT, almost as impressive as the move Otani did when he became the first WCW Cruiserweight title, pinning Benoit. Ogawa came back with a Tiger Driver and a bridging back suplex for the pin. 2.75 stars. 2. Misawa and Jinsei Shinzaki beat Vader and Monokia Mossman in 15:21 from Korakuen Hall. The last 5 minutes aired. It seemed fine, but nothing special. Misawa pinned Mossman after a Tiger Driver. 3. Vader pinned Bart Gunn from Budokan Hall in 6:37. Gunn went for this Santo Plancha with Vader at least 3/4 of the way to the other post on the floor. Somehow, even with a big target like Vader, Gunn actually missed him, but it was kind of an amazing attempt for a guy of that size. Gunn also used a missile drop kick and a choke slam. It was all action, but Gunn isn't that good and Vader carried the match, ending up destroying him in the corner with his clubbing forearms and pinning him after a powerbomb. 2 stars. 4. Akiyama beat Masahito Kakihara from Sapporo in 13:26. Only the last 3:30 aired. Fans weren't into this match, which is a surprise because these are two of the best workers in the business. They just didn't believe Kakihara had a chance to win, which ruined it because Kakihara kept getting submission moves on Akiyama and nobody bought that Akiyama was in danger. Finally, Akiyama hit a double arm DDT and an exploder for the win. It was okay, but a disappointment considering the matchup. Mexico. Due to the influence of the WWF over television, EMLL has been shortening its matches greatly. The general 3-fall Arena Mexico match would go 15 to 25 minutes, and the top 4 matches on the July 2nd show were all less than 10 minutes, even though 3 of them were best 2 out of 3 falls. The main event with Pierroth Jr. and Villano Tercero and Apollo Dantes beating Brazo de Plata and Atlantis and Negro Casas was largely to continue V3 versus Atlantis feud. Atlantis bled a lot and ended up being stretchered out. Black Warrior and Fuerza Guerrera and Bestia Salvaje won straight falls in under 6 minutes total time over Lismark Sr., returning to Arena Mexico for the first time since his heart problems that at one point looked to be career-ending, and Shocker and Mr. Niebla. Shocker turned on Niebla and they were arguing until, as a surprise, a contingent from the rival IWRG promotion including their Mr. Niebla hit the ring with Cyborg Cop, Maniac Cop, Policeman 1 and 2 official and Guardia and argued in the ring. EMLL hasn't done the promotion versus promotion deal in years, if ever. The two groups basically worked together for a long time until the dispute over the Mr. Niebla name ended up separating them about a year back. After the run-in angle, Mascara Sagrada and Pirata Morgan, who had been working regularly for IWRG, appeared 2 days later on the EMLL Sunday show at Arena Coliseo. Blue Panthers' win in a singles match over Super Astro broke the 13-week streak where the Technico had won every Lightning match. EMLL and its openers has a Ricky Martin knockoff with the dancing called Ricky Marvin. Ringo Mendoza beat Scorpio Jr. on July 2nd in Nezahual Coyote to retain the CMLL middleweight title. Apollo Dantes won his hair versus hair match over Pepe Aguayo on July 4th in Guadalajara, which went more than 30 minutes, ending with a DQ finish when Aguayo was caught with the chain Dantes had been using. IWRG is having a tournament every Sunday this month to determine the number 1 contender for its heavyweight champ, Pierroth Jr., who will be in to defend his title on August 1st. Astro Rey Jr. defends his Mexican national welterweight title against Karloff Lagarde Jr. on July 5th at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. This was set up in a trios match where Lagarde pinned Rey in the final fall on June 29th. The July 9th Arena Mexico show is headlined by Leo Del Santo and Casas and Shocker, still on the face side after doing turns for the last 2 months, and Niebla versus Fuerza Guerrera and Blue Panther, Black Warrior and Scorpio Jr. in the Lightning match. Tiger Blanco, who is 6'3", faces Virus, who is 5 feet tall. All Japan. The new tour opened on July 4th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,100. Kenta Kobashi didn't even miss one match due to his nasal surgery. Apparently he wasn't even supposed to start training, and in his training was in great pain. Particularly every bump felt like his head was going to explode because he just had the operation on June 16th. It said his nose hurt even when washing his face. Kobashi came out wearing a nose guard and a mask similar to the style Vader wears to keep it in place for his tag match teaming with Kentaro Shiga against Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori. Takayama and Omori removed the guard and continually attacked the nose with punches and kicks. Legitimately, the doctors warned Kobashi about coming back too fast because he'd risk having to have the operation done all over again. But with his mentality, he didn't listen. The main event had Mitsuharu Misawa and Masahito Kakihara lose to Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao when Kakihara did the job, as expected. The story out of this match is that Misawa suffered a broken eardrum from a hard slap by Kawada. The way these guys slap, that's certainly believable. But since Kawada is challenging Misawa for the Triple Crown on July 24th and they usually do the big angle on the first show, presume this to be an angle. After the July 24th show, they'll be off until August 21st for a tour that goes through September 4th and will include the debut of the Gladiator, Mike Awesome, and Too Cold Scorpio. June 27th TV show did a 3.4 rating. New Japan. The biggest angle is that Atsushi Onita didn't appear at the July 1st Gifu show as had been announced but was announced as going to appear at the July 20th and July 21st shows in Sapporo. Masahiro Chono is no longer going by the NWO name, although that name NWO Japan is still being used for Keiji Muto's rival group with Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Scott Norton, Hiro Saito, and Satoshi Kojima. Chono's Team 2000 consists of himself, Onita, Non-Fry, Akira, NWO Sting and Michael Wallstreet. Akira, whose wife is a famous actress, gets steady work as an actor. He's not a big-name actor but he doesn't work a full wrestling schedule because of acting commitments mainly in plays. Business has been very strong over the past week for what are basically normal lineups. NWO Sting was supposed to arrive to join Chono's group on July 5th, but due to WCW keeping him a few extra days to do the Georgia Dome angle, he's arriving late this week. We'll have more detailed reviews probably next week, but I did get to see Hashimoto's return in the Super Junior Tournament final from the June 8th Budokan Hall show. Hashimoto definitely lost the weight they said he did, but it's funny because he just looks like smaller and less powerful version of himself at 259 than he did at 305. Since he and Tenryu basically stood there and pounded on each other, and it wasn't a match that relied on movement, he seemed less effective. Also, even losing that weight, he still has that fleshy look rather than improving any muscularity. The tournament final with Kendo Kashin beating Koji Kanemoto was a good match, but nowhere close to the level of basically any final I can remember historically, and also introduced foreign objects, a metal case, to the juniors division. About the lineup for the G1 shows was announced with 6 tournament matches every night plus a 7th championship match between the two groups champions on the final night on August 15th at Sumo Hall. August 10th at Osaka Furitsu Gym has Yuji Nagata vs Kojima, Kensuke Sasaki vs Tadao Yasuda. Yasuda suffered a shoulder injury this past week and will be out of action until G1. Tatsumi Fujinami vs Muto, Kazuo Yamazaki vs Manabu Nakanishi, Shinya Hashimoto vs Tenzan and Shiro Koshinaka vs Chono. August 11th in Osaka has Muto vs Nagata, Sasaki vs Kojima, Fujinami vs Yasuda, Yamazaki vs Tenzan, Koshinaka vs Nakanishi and Hashimoto vs Chono. August 13th at Sumo Hall has Kojima vs Yasuda, Fujinami vs Nagata, Sasaki vs Muto, Koshinaka vs Tenzan, Chono vs Nakanishi and Hashimoto vs Yamazaki. August 14th at Sumo Hall has Muto vs Yasuda, Sasaki vs Nagata, Fujinami vs Kojima, Nakanishi vs Tenzan, Yamazaki vs Chono and Hashimoto vs Koshinaka. August 15th besides the finals has Nagata vs Yasuda, Muto vs Kojima, Fujinami vs Sasaki, Koshinaka vs Yamazaki, Hashimoto vs Nakanishi and Chono vs Tenzan. June 26th TV show did a 3.4 rating. Both shows this week aired past 2 a.m. so the ratings should be lower than typical. Other Japan notes. Antonio Inoki this past week went to North Korea to discuss possibilities of doing another major show there. In 1995, Inoki and New Japan put on 2 shows at Mayday Stadium which both drew in excess of 150,000 fans, the 2 largest recorded crowds for pro wrestling in history. We haven't seen the tape yet, but reports from Japan are that the June 24th Rings show at Korakuen Hall was a contender for Best Major Show of the Year, and that the crowd went crazy for the Yoshihisa Yamamoto vs. Kiyoshi Tamura main event, with loud chants for both men and chants of rings after the conclusion of the 20-minute draw. The report we got compared that match favorably to the Misawa vs. Kobashi match held 2 weeks earlier at Budokan Hall. Big Japan finished its tournament to determine a new junior heavyweight champion, with Masayoshi Motegi beating Abdullah Jr. Kobayashi on June 30th in Shizuoka. They did a deal where all the participants in the tournament were weighed in to make sure they made weight. The gimmick revolved around Kobayashi, who is really blubbery, except he's so short that he legit weighed in at only 193 pounds. Throughout the tour at the shows, they were all making fun of him being in a junior heavyweight tournament. Rookie Jun Kasai is a pretty solid worker with a good look, but he's very short as well. Neo Ladies did an angle on July 4th in Kawasaki. The main event was Kyoko Inoue vs. Zappai, which wound up with chairs, chains, kendo sticks, etc. involved. Zap T interfered and it was 2-on-1 until Takako Inoue made the save. Kyoko and Takako as the Double Inus were a hot tag team years back in the AJW glory years. Rings announced its schedule for the rest of the year as an August 18th show at Yokohama Bunka Gym, with the Naoya Ogawa vs. Yoshihisa Yamamoto proposed main event, September 15th at Korakuen Hall, October 28th at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym 2 and December 22nd at Osaka Furitsu Gym. This announcement shows the decline in the company, as traditionally they book major arena monthly shows from October through January for the annual Mega Battle Tournament, which is what the company traditionally peaks every year with. Last year they switched from the traditional 16-man tournament to a team tournament, which ended up being a total flop, and this year it appears there won't be a tournament at all. Satoru Sayama's first show of his new promotion is July 11th in Okinawa, headlined by Sayama vs. Minoru Tanaka under Vale Tudo rules. Sayama, who is 41, has never done a legit shoot match since his days as a kickboxer in the late 70s, so I don't buy this as a shoot. Branko Sikatic, the first ever K1 Grand Prix champion back in 1993, who had a ridiculous shoot match with Mark Kerr, along with Kazunari Murakami, who toured the US with Ogawa for the NWA, and Boss Rutan are also on the show. Rutan's name is most interesting. Toriuman is currently in the midst of its new tour and announced a 2-show tour on September 14th at Korakuen Hall and September 15th in Yokosuka. Grant Hamada and teenage daughter Ayako Hamada will form a tag team on the August 29th Michinoku show in Maebashi. A correction regarding Chad Collier, who had a recent WCW tryout and will be on the next Michinoku Pro Tour, I believe is Cali Man under a mask build as being from South Africa. He is a student of Dean Malenko, not Leigh Thatcher, but he wrestles for Thatcher. Here and there. There was a lot of national news coverage this past week over an incident where a 3-year-old child was killed, blamed in part on his older brother, who inadvertently killed him through imitating pro wrestling he'd seen on television. It actually took place on May 23rd in Dallas, with the child dying in the hospital 4 days later from brain swelling from landing on the back of his head on the floor after being hit with a clothesline. The story didn't come to light until June 30th when the Dallas Morning News ran a story about the incident because the 7-year-old told the police while in tears, saying he didn't mean to hurt his brother, saying he was copying Steve Austin and The Undertaker. Bart Sawyer and Chris Michaels, who wrestled each other earlier in the show in a dog collar match, won the NWA North American Tag Team titles. Music City Wrestling, on July 3rd in Nashville from Ladies Night Out, Frenchie Riviera and Shane Eaton. Farron Fox won the group's TV title from TJ Gray when Ballet Savannah shoved the ref into her boobs to distract him. Wolfie D and Flash Flanagan returned on the show facing the New South. Nicole Bass was announced as being in the corner of Jackie Fargo for his match where he puts his hair up against Stacy's hair, in a match against Jerry Lawler on July 10th in Nashville. Terry Taylor will be brought in to wrestle Colorado Kid for the NA title on the same show. The Memphis television show was moved from its normal Saturday morning time slot, where it was taped, to 3 a.m. that night due to Wimbledon coverage by NBC. They did an angle at the June 26th arena show where Chris Cannonball was injured, as he's on tour with All Japan as Pierre, and they announced J.R. Smooth was suspended for doing the angle, allowing him the chance to head home. A correction from last week's assumption. The valet siren is not Shannon Hall, nor was she sent to Memphis by the WWF, so she's a local woman. Dave Brown announced the TV ratings on June 26 were the highest in the history of the PPW promotion. In the angle where Cannonball was injured, Ikmo powerbombed him through a table, then piledrove him through a table, but Glenn Kulka and Matty Smalls, who was part of the Samoan Gangstas in ECW for a short period of time, interfered, bring out Kurt Angle, and finally Smooth hit Cannonball in the knees with a baseball bat to break his leg. The next Memphis show will be July 10th at the New Daisy Theater, and they announced Tommy Rich, Doug Gilbert, Steve Bradley, Wolfie D and Dirty White Boy all on the show. Kevin Christian and Kevin Lawler did an interview complaining about them not having a spot for him in the company as an announcer and said Brown and Corey Macklin were horrible announcers. Brown told him that he was so awful on commentary that even his relatives called to complain. Randy Hales came out and said Christian wanted everything given to him, which led to a match between the two of them, which if Christian won, he'd get a job with the company. Kulka hit Hales with a garbage can, so Christian won. TV Main was a three-way for the Young Guns title held by Kid Wicked, which ended when Vic Grimes pinned Robbie D. Grimes is now a face and Wicked is back as a heel. International Pro Wrestling is looking for wrestlers, managers and valets. For consideration, send a photo and action video to P.O. Box 87, Andreas, Pennsylvania 18211. Jim Shields of Clovis, California, a former college wrestling star who did some pro wrestling in the 70s, placed second at the 1999 Veterans Nationals in freestyle wrestling in the 51 and over age group. On an NWA Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling show on June 26 in Hickory, North Carolina, the main event with Brad Anderson and Drake Dawson beating the Border Patrol ended in 30 seconds, with the latter team losing in a match that was scheduled to go a lot longer, which may spell the end for the Patrol, who have appeared of late on some WCW tapings with that group. Indie name from the last department went in a little hard, who was one of the major women wrestling stars of the early 80s, worked some women's tag matches for Jerry Gray's World Pro Wrestling on an Ohio tour June 25th and June 26th. They did some major Roller Jam tapings in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand this past week. The crowds ranged from 800 to 2,500, but virtually all of them were cops. Every room at the hotel had a ticket voucher, and everyone who bought a ticket was told they could trade in their ticket stub for a free ticket for the next game. Roller Jam will be coming out with a new newsstand magazine and has a line of action figures coming out and a video game deal, so that type of merchandise may keep the thing going from the other end. Apparently the skaters, as far as doing PR, were very good, as they worked a lobby table doing autographs, and there were consistent long lines, and the skaters were very cordial at the hotel. A sad note was that referee Don Lastra's wife was killed in a head-on collision en route to Las Vegas. Lastra still worked the games but was said to be clearly in a daze. Ken Resnick is done as announcer, and the new announcer is Rory Marcus, a Southern California sports announcer who was said to have been a huge improvement. The shows were built around a new storyline largely to follow ECW, where Roller Jam has a heel owner, Original, who wants to rid the sport of sex and violence. This was met by Mark D'Amato organizing the rebellious face group called Souk, Skaters Unified Coalition, and the girls rebelling by wearing individualistic uniforms to expose more flesh, which resulted in accidental breasts being exposed. Denise Loden skated an entire jam with her breast exposed, and Cindy Zimmerman had her breast pop out 6 times in one game. It ended up in a match race where Sean Atkinson represented the owner and D'Amato faced him with the winner to get control of the league, which D'Amato. The games themselves were said to have been better after the early games, which was on a new, almost unskatable track which was too slick and the skaters were falling left and right. They also has a Miss Roller Derby Queen contest with Stacy Blitch, Amy Craig, Suzanne Shalin, Lindsay Francis, and Loden. The heel owner said Francis had won, but somehow it came out that Loden had really won. The women were all in evening gowns and it wound up with a big cat fight. Apparently things got ugly as Loden and Blitch went after Francis, who in real life is unpopular among the skaters, and it turned into a real fight which wasn't broken up and shocked the crowd to the point some audience members walked out, and most of the crowd sensed the reality and instead of reacting, were stunned into silence by it. Even though they've built Loden up as the new Golden Girl Joan Weston babyface type, the crowd was more into Blitch with her huge implants, and Loden was booed even though put in the position of being the top face. The next tapings are set for Biloxi, Mississippi, and they are claiming they'll do a 105-city tour starting in September, but with a product that hasn't caught on. That spells disaster. MMA. Pancrase announced at its July 6 Korakuen Hall show that they were entering into an affiliation with the new UFC Japan company. The Japanese company has leased the UFC name and will run shows, but will be largely independent of UFC in the US, and the shows won't be produced for American television consumption. They were openly discussing the possibility of a Masakatsu Funaki vs. Kazushi Sakuraba match for the first show. No date was announced for a first show. Pancrase apparently had some explosive finishes on the card, headlined by Semishal beating Asami Shibuya in 12:06 with a choke. Keiichiro Yamamiya beat Leon Dake via TKO in 2:05 and Yuki Kondo knocked out Daisuke Watanabe in just 24 seconds with an open hand. They also had a Pancration, Vale Tudo, rules match with Katsumi Inagaki of Pancrase beating outsider Yasuaki Hiromatsu in 5:58 with punches from the mount. Pancrase officially announced Kondo vs Kyuma Kunyoku as the main event of its September 18th anniversary pay-per-view show from Tokyo Bay NK Hall. It will be the fifth meeting of the two during their careers, all of which have gone the time limit without a conclusive winner or even a point scored, with each man scoring one win via judges' decisions and the other two being judged draws. K1 promoter Kazuyoshi Ishii announced they had contracted to bring in fighters from the Chinese Thunder Group. This would be the first time fighters from China would ever compete in a combat sport in recent memory. Chinese Thunder fighters combine kickboxing and judo into one sport, so that changes the fight and would make the fighters novices at pure kickboxing without the throws and submission aspects of judo. Saw photos of the Schultz vs Gilbert Evel match from Amsterdam on June 20th. It was clearly a war with Schultz taking a real beating, including having his left eye swollen shut. ECW. They shot the major angles to set up the new card for the July 18th pay-per-view show on July 3rd in Queens, New York before a sellout of 1,000 for a television show that won't air until the weekend of the show. The most complicated angle, setting up the Jerry Lynn and Rob Van Dam vs. Justin Credible and Lance Storm main event, was shot out of a Storm vs. Lynn singles match. After a ref bump, Credible interfered with cane shots to the face, doing the angle that they re-injured the nose that Lynn legit broke on the last pay-per-view show. Jazz, Harleen Moore, went to stop the onslaught with the idea that even though she's in Credible's camp, even she couldn't stand it. Jason then attacked her to set up their singles match on the pay-per-view. Sabu ran in to clean house and was soon overpowered and they were beating on him. Van Dam ran in and hit a Van Daminator on Lynn by accident when Storm moved, leading to Storm's win. He then did a dive to save Sabu but ended up hitting him. After the match, Lynn broke down Van Dam's dressing room door and when it opened, you saw Sabu and Van Dam about to go at it with Bill Alfonso separating them. Van Dam was trying to tell Sabu it was all an accident. Lynn asked Van Dam to be his partner against Credible and Storm and Alfonso said that no way was Van Dam teaming with anyone but Sabu. Van Dam noted that Sabu had already teamed with Lynn last week at ECW Arena and said he was taking the match. The story around the match is they are going to basically say that Sabu is going to interfere in the finish, but you don't know if it'll be for or against Van Dam when he does it, since they also teased dissension last week when Sabu accidentally put Fonzie through a table when Credible moved, leading to Lynn getting pinned in their tag match. The danger to that is that fans will know that no near fall is really the finish until Sabu does his run-in, which may hurt if they book a really long match. The other key angle is that Steve Corino, Yoshihiro Tajiri and Jack Victory have formed a new heel group with Tajiri doing more Great Muta-type mannerisms and they laid out Taz. It started with Tajiri winning a three-way over Super Crazy and Little Guido. Taz came out and talked about how much he respected Tajiri as a wrestler. Corino came out and did his insulting of Taz and when Taz went after him, Tajiri laid Taz out with a kick. The plan after some Taz vs Tajiri matches got a great reaction at the house shows, is to make this a long-term title program rather than simply just an angle that ends at the pay-per-view. Also on the show, Tommy Dreamer did a long interview talking about the history of ECW and guys like Raven, Sandman, Conan, Rey Mysterio Jr., Juventud Guerrera and Psicosis before Corino came out again and started running down Dreamer saying he's a 28-year-old has-been and should retire. Dreamer started copying Rock's catchphrases. Don't know how it came across, but whenever you see people copying WWF catchphrases on indie shows or on WCW, it comes off really lame. Francine ended up pinning Corino as she does every night. The other weekend house shows saw July 1st in Staten Island, New York draw 900, July 2nd in Poughkeepsie drew about 1,000 and July 4th in Belmar, New Jersey draw 500. Chris Condito was backstage at the July 4th show. Condito and Tammy Sitch may be brought back again. Paul Heyman said he'd bring them back provided they stay clean, and he's also encouraging Tammy Sitch and also Dawn Marie to attend college due to the reality that for ECW fans, the women acts get used up and washed up probably by the age of 30. Sitch's only value appears to be as someone with major league stardom when the TNN show debuts with Sid having gone to WCW. Condito is under the impression both will be returning soon, but Heyman has told others in the company nothing is going to happen quickly and not to count on anything. Van Dam injured his ankles doing a flip dive with his ankle crashing down hard on the guardrail on July 3rd and missed the July 4th show but isn't expected out of action for long. They also did an angle in Queens where Skull Von Crush went by his real name of Vito Lagrassi, But after the match he was given 3D by the Dudleys, who then ran down New York fans. A Plant fan threw beer at Bubba, who jumped the guardrail and attacked the fan to set up Spike doing a dive off the balcony onto Bubba. They ended up overpowering Spike until Balls Mahoney made the save with chair shots on the Dudleys. Heyman may be giving Venom Black from Tijuana a tryout. TV this past weekend finished up the tapings from Villa Park, Illinois. The first match was Dudleys versus Balls and Spike. It was your basic blood match. Spike did a balcony plancha. Dudleys did 3D on him, but Mahoney saved with a chair shot. You can tell they do the same basic match in every city because the timing and spots look totally choreographed. Joey Styles is obviously under orders to put the Dudleys over as the greatest tag team in ECW history because it's incessantly pushed. The problem is the two guys still have such a minor league look to them that by calling them the greatest in history, it reflects more about history badly than positively about the Dudleys. They set the match up to build for the flaming tables and thumbtacks powerbomb on Mahoney, which the crowd went absolutely nuts for, and were going crazy for Mahoney even after he lost. The other match was Van Dam versus Storm. Van Dam did a lot of high-risk stuff early, including a twisting leg drop off the apron onto Storm, who was sprawled over the guardrail. Van Dam also missed a crossbody running dive over the guardrail and did a somersault body block off the guardrail onto Storm. They worked hard, but the match didn't build well, and it was a decent match, probably disappointing given who was in it, and the crowd heat couldn't compare with the Guido vs. Tajiri match the previous week. Credible interfered and hit RVD with the cane. The lights went out and Sabu appeared to make the save, doing a dive on Credible and a second plancha through the table. The crowd was really into the run-in. Lynn ended up helping Van Dam use the Van Daminator on Storm for the win, but they tried to build mystery as to whether Lynn actually came to help Van Dam or Storm. WCW. It is expected that the tag match with Nash and Sting vs. Vicious and Savage on the July 11th pay-per-view show will be ruled as the winner of the fall gets the title. Nash talked about it on WCW Live, but it hasn't been mentioned on television, but has been talked about in discussion but not necessarily as a finalized decision within the booking meetings. It still appears Hogan will end up with the title by the fall. The only other thing added to the show is Hack's Junkyard match won't be against one guy, but all sorts of guys will be running in and fighting him and each other, including a few Mexican wrestlers, Brian Knobbs, and they've even talked about debuting Too Cold Scorpio in that scenario. Also on the show is Disco Inferno vs. Ernest Miller, with the loser not being able to dance anymore. The last plan, and remember everything changes on a moment's notice, is that Miller would win but that Disco would still dance anyway and they'd just ignore the stipulation. Kind of like a WWF mask vs. mask or loser leaves town match. The Georgia Dome Nitro opened with a hot match with Juventud Guerrero vs. Chavo Guerrero Jr., which went 7-16 before Savage and Sid did a run-in and beat both of them up. Sid got a total babyface reaction. They did a promo and Nash appeared on the video wall with Torrie Wilson. Nobody got their points across, and this was a clumsy angle which ended up setting up Nash vs. Sid as the main event. Rick and David Flair and company, including a bevy of models, came out. Rick stripped Scott Steiner of the US title. You want to know the reason? He said Scott was so busy with all his hooches that he didn't have time to defend the title. That sure makes the belt seem important. Bagwell came out and issued a challenge to David. Buff has got to be the geekiest babyface in the business. He is kissing up to the crowd unmercifully. At the end, Buff told them to hit his music, and they didn't. Rick Steiner beat Vampiro with his new as yet unnamed submission hold in 1:19. It was similar to but not exactly like Kensuke Sasaki's power strangle. I guess we can call it a what-a-ta maneuver. It kind of boggles the mind to see Vamp get treated like such an uncompetitive performer and being used as a setup man for a match with Van Hammer, like anyone could think Hammer has more potential, but I guess someone does. Lenny Lane and Lodi did their act hinting they are lovers, and Lodi saying how he knows all of Lenny's measurements. They showed a closet in the corner with the word closet on it. This stuff is bad. I think only people who consider pornos as high-class entertainment can enjoy these WCW skits. Then came the Bret Hart video and interview. They did an angle which played throughout the show with Eddie Guerrero claiming one of the Mexicans stole his wallet, but he didn't know which one because they all wore masks. It wound up with Doug Dillinger ordering them to unmask, but the cameras shot it from behind so we couldn't see their faces, and Eddie reacted to them. One of the Mexicans was Cheetah Kid, and when he unmasked, Eddie noted he was Prince Aokia. They also noted that Blitzkrieg wasn't Mexican. Eddie acted really scared when Cyclope and La Parka unmasked. The angle went nowhere because none of them stole his wallet. So there's still a kleptomaniac in the dressing room. The idea behind it is that Bischoff wants all the Mexicans to unmask, Psicosis in particular, and originally it was going to be shot from the front as a way to build to that. But who knows how ideas get changed, and it turned out to be just a useless time filler. It would be a big mistake to have Parka unmask, and probably Blitzkrieg as well, since he looks like a high school kid. Blitzkrieg does desperately need a new ring outfit because the one he wears looks too minor league on Nitro. Jerry Flynn beat Ernest Miller via DQ in a kickboxing match at 1:49 of the second round. They wore big gloves. The crowd hated this bad. Nothing is worse than fake kickboxing with a pro wrestling finish. Miller hit Flynn when he was down for the DQ, then they started rolling on the ground and throwing punches at each other. Hammer beat Lodi in 4:06 after superplexing Lane and doing the Cobra Clutch Slam on Lodi. Piper came out and said he was the original Highlander and the original Bret Hart. Then he stopped making sense. This was one of Piper's worst interviews. He called out a short, fake sting. The crowd was sick of fake stings. Piper attacked him, which made him a total face. He then ripped on Bagwell and challenged him to a 10-round boxing match. J.J. Dillon came out with Mills Lane, of Judge Mills Lane and ref of many famous boxing matches, including the Tyson Holyfield second match. By the way, he did a WWF Raw angle last year, but they announced as referee for Piper Bagwell. Lane didn't know if the pay-per-view was in California or Florida, and he still did the second best interview of the entire show. He had no idea what was going on, but at least sounded enthused about it. Konnan and Mysterio Jr. beat Regal and Finlay in 2:33 via DQ when the Cowboys interfered. Konnan and Mysterio Jr. were supposed to win first before the run-in, but the match got cut so many times it wound up the way it was. The Cowboys also laid out Swollen, who was wearing a bandana over his head so he looked like a taller version of Mustafa, Chase Tatum and B.A. Brad Armstrong. The cameras focused on Hennig, who unfortunately was trying to get heat on Swollen, who didn't really know what he was doing, and Hennig seemingly was in a conversation with him in the corner trying to explain it was time to bump, and eventually he did. David Flair beat Bagwell to keep the U.S. title. Flair and Arn ran in, but Charles Robinson wouldn't DQ them. Bagwell had David pinned after his blockbuster, but Robinson's arm went out. Malenko ran in for the save. Bagwell slammed Asya, but then Piper ran in and KO'd Bagwell with a foreign object, so David won in 3:16. Malenko was in the wrong position, so it looked really bad as he got out of the ring to make sure Robinson could count the pin. Hawk did an interview. At least his voice came back. They acted like there was power trouble and he'd broken into the show. Hennig did a concert. Duncombe and Wyndham's are now known as the West Texas Rednecks. A lot of fans cheered when they asked if there were any rednecks in the crowd. When they asked if people hated rap, there were both a lot of cheers and a lot of boos. Duncombe and even more so Hennig and Kendall Windham playing guitar made Ernest Miller's kickboxing match look real. This is a big cult deal to a lot of people, but it was heavily booed at the finish. Benoit and Malenko and Saturn beat the Triad in a non-title match when Benoit pinned Bigelow after a diving headbutt in 9:22. This was a good match. Show finished with Megadeth, Nash vs. Sid, and the finish involving Savage. For June 18th in the UK, Raw was viewed by 380,000 to 270,000 for Nitro, while Thunder drew 140,000 viewers. Very little of note on the tape Thunder. They did a show-long angle with Nash and Savage where Nash was to give back Gorgeous George and Savage was to give back the title belt that he stole at Nitro. They finally met in this back alley-looking place. Savage, Sid and NWO Sting all beat up Nash and left him laying, and grabbed the girl, who was all covered up and wearing a hood, and left. Like 20 minutes later, they stopped the car and took her hood off, and it was Tori Wilson, not Gorgeous George. Like they couldn't tell that the girl in the hood was a foot taller than George. She noted that Big Sexy was a lot smarter than those guys think. The ratings the next day sure didn't say that. Mysterio Jr. and Blitzkrieg had a very good cruiser title match to no fanfare. Parka said something in English about no more LWO. Zbyszko then said he didn't understand what he said even though it was in English, and Tenay agreed with Zbyszko about it not being English even though it was. If that wasn't bad enough, Tenay had to sell for the rest of the show about how it was clear it was Sting who had turned on Nash, and he was right. Raven's infection after surgery for his gynecomastia came close to being life-threatening as doctors told him if he'd waited much longer to come to the hospital he could have died. Rodman not only canceled out of the Georgia Dome, but no-showed a magazine photo shoot. There are reports that Swollen signed a one-year contract for $400,000, which is said to be not all that much less than Jericho was offered. There also are reports that Master P was getting $200,000 per appearance on Nitro. Has the world gone nuts? Master P also got WCW to sign Chase Tatum and Teddy the Tank Reed to one-year deals. Nothing new on the status of Ric Flair wrestling. Contrary to a lot of reports, Ric Flair was never scheduled to wrestle Nash in Chicago. Originally the plan was for Nash vs. Sid in Chicago, then it got changed to Nash vs. David and the Sid match was moved the next week to Atlanta. The rumors got started when Flair on Thunder talked about a big surprise for Nash in Chicago, which when he did the interview, meant David not Rick, with everyone at ringside. Savage appeared on ESPN's X Games taped in San Francisco over the weekend. He didn't make any more sense there than he does on wrestling. At this point no decision has been made regarding Jimmy Hart's proposals for changing around WCW Saturday Night. Weekend house shows were July 2nd in Shreveport drawing 3,798 paying $77,125 and July 3rd in Monroe, Louisiana drawing 6,007 paying $103,925, with both shows headlined by Sting over Sid. Merchandise for the shows over the past week was $133,785 or $4.57 per head, which may be the lowest week for per cap merchandising since this boom started. Johnny Boone suffered a concussion in an auto accident and was out of action. Brian Hildebrand drove in for the Nitro to return to work but woke up in Atlanta with a 102.9-degree fever and didn't work the show. Mickey J suffered never damage from that power bomb from Sid on the pay-per-view show. Major show in October are a house show October 3rd in Oklahoma City, Nitro at Kemper Arena in Kansas City on October 4th, Nitro at the Uno Lakefront Arena in New Orleans, as opposed to the much larger Superdome that they had been running in, on October 11th, WCW Saturday Night taping on October 12th in Thibodaux, Louisiana, Thunder October 14th in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, house show October 17th in Philadelphia at the Spectrum, Nitro on October 18th at Nassau Coliseum, house show October 22nd at the Oakland Coliseum Arena, Havoc pay-per-view on October 24th in Las Vegas, Nitro on October 25th in Phoenix. WCW Saturday Night taping on October 26th in San Bernardino, California, Thunder on October 27th in San Diego at Cox Arena, and there will be a tour of Germany starting October 29th. Shane Douglas should be on Nitro within the next 2 weeks. Nikita Koloff, 40, was on WCW Live, talking about being in great shape and being interested in returning to the ring. This may be the last year for Road Wild in its current form of being a free show in Sturgis. When the company was growing, it was kind of Bischoff's play toy, but with the company having big expenses, the idea of giving up a live gate and merchandise which adds up to $350,000 to $500,000 so somebody can write off riding their bikes for a week as a business expense is something that becomes second-guessed. Not to mention there has yet to be a Road Wild show that wasn't really bad due to the atmosphere. WWF. Vince McMahon suffered a cracked tailbone in a motorcycle accident on July 4th in Greenwich, Connecticut. Reports are that McMahon was coming around a corner and was hit by a driver backing his car out of his driveway and knocked off his motorcycle and shaken up. He was back at work producing Raw on July 5th and in the office on July 6th. King of the Ring did an estimated 1.13 buy rate, which is up in total buys to about 440,000, but basically the same buy rate as last year. That would be a $5.67 million company gross out of the show. The show didn't quite hit the level of triple what the Great American Bash did 2 weeks earlier, 0.43 for the July 25th fully loaded pay-per-view, although there are reports to the contrary. At press time only 6 matches have been finalized. Austin vs. Undertaker first blood for the title with the Stips. If Austin wins, McMahon must leave WWF television, and if Austin loses, he can never challenge for the WWF title ever again. If we look at the last 3 loser leave town Stips in the WWF, we see Sable, who lost to Mark Merrow on a pay-per-view and was back 2 weeks later without even a storyline bad reason, just simply Vince wanted her back, Mark Merrow, who actually never came back, which in hindsight we can all see why. And Rodney and Pete Gas, who lost a loser leaves the WWF match on Raw, are back a few weeks later without even a mention that they lost a loser leaves match or even as bad an explanation as the one given for Sable. They're billing it as the end of an era. Also, it'll be Rock vs. Triple H vs. Mankind in a 3-way, which one would assume Triple H goes over in to set him up for a title shot at SummerSlam. Big Show vs. Kane, which may be an Inferno match. X-Pac and Road Dogg vs. Mr. Ass in China in a match where the winning team supposedly gets all the DX royalties. Shamrock vs. Blackman in some sort of an as of yet not decided gimmick match, and Hardy Boys defending the tag titles against Acolytes. There will probably be 3 more matches, which could be D'Lo Brown vs. Mideon, Godfather and Val Venus vs. Prince Albert and Draws and or Jarrett vs. Test, or Edge vs. Gangrel, but that's not as yet finalized. Final decisions haven't been made on exactly what context Sunday Night Heat will take starting in late August. It's basically certain there won't be specific Heat tapings on Sundays, and that Sunday shows, except on pay-per-view weeks, will be regular house shows. There is some talk of doing one live Heat per month as a live deal 1 hour before the pay-per-view starts. But that isn't definite either, as there is a school of thought that notices the crowd heat this year at the WWF pay-per-view shows is way down from prior years, even though overall enthusiasm at Raw tapings and house shows is up. The feeling, and I agree with this, is that 4 hours is just too long for a show and they can keep the crowd up for a fast-moving Heat. But when the pay-per-view starts and they do actual matches, the crowd is often dead. Not much from the Raw taping in Fayetteville, North Carolina that wasn't already covered. It was an average Raw show. Everything seemed to make sense in its context and the characters and storylines seemed to lead somewhere. Except for Meat, who just seemed out there. Like a dead log wearing underwear that got washed with the dark clothes and came out pink. I'm sure someone out there thinks him wearing that as a ring outfit will get him over with women, but I'd bet the only people who think that are guys. Vic Grimes made a good impression on doing a dark match at the Memphis tapings with Al Snow and is being considered to be brought in shortly. A correction from a few weeks back when writing about Sylvester Turkey, who is UFO Big Van Vader in Japan. Turkey has not been signed to a WWF developmental deal, although WWF is interested in him. Nothing official has changed regarding the situation with Rena Mero. There was talk that WWF would consider her appearing on Nitro as a contract breach, and her contract specifies that if there is a breach the party forfeits future merchandise royalties, but at that point that hasn't happened. Big Boss Man will appear on America's Most Wanted on July 10th. There was a wanted guy on the show who greatly resembled Boss Man, causing a lot of calls that the guy they are looking for is on WWF television and they are bringing Boss Man on to joke about it. WWF The Music is down to number 150 on the chart, selling 10,633 units. Some notes on the aftermath of King of the Ring. Apparently the timing problems were because 3 of the matches ended way early, 2 of which were X-Pac vs. Road Dogg, which ended way short, and X-Pac vs. Billy Gunn. When it came time for the main event, it was only 9:57 p.m. even with videos and the introduction and stalling. That would have required the main event to go 40 minutes, and it was decided that wasn't a smart idea. There was also a screw-up in the Big Show vs. Kane match, particularly the finish. There was that spot where Kane held that choke literally forever. Show was supposed to get up but was looking for a cue, which either didn't come or did, but he didn't see it and both guys got lost, sat there, panicked, and it was impromptu, and not good impromptu from there. Mick Foley has gotten more than 1,000 get-well cards. There was a huge story in the Calgary Sun on Davey Boy Smith, saying he's back to training twice a day, and hopes to be back in the ring in the WWF by the end of the summer. Smith said in the article that he doesn't feel any pain in his spine. Regarding the lawsuit, Smith was trying to remain neutral, publicly saying, "Martha and Brett have the right to do what they want with the lawsuit. But I don't point fingers." Smith has been telling people that he won't be able to take any suplexes but thinks he can work around that. House shows for the week saw the Raw tapings on June 29th in Fayetteville, North Carolina drew a sellout 8,227, paying $184,718. June 30th in White Plains, New York drew a sellout 3,326, paying $90,600. July 1st in Ottawa, Ontario drew 6,741, paying $193,663, and July 2nd in Montreal drew 13,198, paying $349,657. Austin had the week off after Fayetteville, so in Ottawa they went with Rock over Undertaker via DQ, and Montreal was Rock over Boss Man and Big Show over Undertaker via DQ. Helmsley and X-Pac also had the house shows off. Merchandise for the week was $175,926 US or $5.59 per head. GTV presumably will turn out to be Goldust, out of action with a legit back injury, filming as a way to write him back in when he's ready. WWF will be doing an Owen Hart special issue of WWF magazine with the profits going to the Alberta Children's Hospital. The readers' pages. Owen Hart. The amount of mail you've received on the Owen Hart tragedy is amazing. I've never seen such an outpouring of grief and opinions in the entire time I've read the newsletter. Such a senseless waste. I'm afraid I have to agree with the bottom liners. This is about a family man who wanted to get out of the business, didn't have a big ego and just wanted to fade into the sunset with his family. It's so sad. Do you feel the Hart family is going to stick it to Vince after his callous use of the funeral footage against their wishes? On the other side of the fence, Eric Bischoff seems to have the biggest and worst case of tunnel vision I've ever seen. Like he's not the worst ever at recycling feuds? How many times have we seen Piper versus Hogan, Hogan versus Flair, Flair versus Piper and Flair versus Savage? And how he's bringing back Dennis the Drunk Rodman. Obviously things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. I'm curious to see how ECW does on TNN. Will they have to really tone down their style? Will they be viewed as a low-budget rip-off of the WWF, even though the WWF stole their edge? And since TNN is available in Canada, how will they be accepted here? Finally, I urge all hardcore fans who are tired of sports entertainment to get your hands on some All Japan or New Japan tapes. No BS, just straight ahead good solid matches with amazing drama. See what it's like to have a simple clothesline or forearm really mean something in a match. The selling is phenomenal. I don't see how you can read the Japanese TV rundowns without wanting to see those matches on a regular basis. It might be tough to find, but boy is it worth it. Dan Lovronsky. Toronto, Ontario. There was an incident in the world of sports that made me think of a comparison to the death of Owen Hart. It was the seizure suffered by Houston Astros manager Larry Dierker during the game against the San Diego Padres. At the time it happened, nobody was exactly sure what was happening, but everybody knew it was something serious. All thoughts of the game and continuing the game vanished. Dierker's health was everyone's prime concern, not the outcome of a baseball game. The game was suspended, to be started the next time the Padres were in Houston. Nobody was thinking we have to complete the game or the fans are going to riot. The fans knew Dierker's welfare was far more important. Compare that situation with what happened to Owen Hart. Granted, there is far more money on the line for a wrestling pay-per-view than in one individual baseball game. But the fans in Kansas City, like the fans in Houston, knew there was a serious problem unfolding before their eyes. Some in the building thought it was a work, of course. I believe if the fans had been told the real truth, that Hart had died in the tragic fall, and that the WWF was canceling or postponing the show, not one fan would have caused any trouble. I think the shock of the announcement would have caused even the craziest of fans to stop, think, and maybe pray. I believe Vince McMahon handled the situation quite badly. The show should have been stopped. There was no reason to continue the show other than avoiding a loss of income. No tribute show to Owen Hart can erase that. John Quinn. New York, New York. Owen Hart was the wrestler who made me watch European wrestling when he was booked by Otto Wanz in 1990. When Larry Cameron died in the ring in Bremen, Germany, Otto Wanz immediately stopped the show. Nobody even asked for refunds. I don't think people would have asked for refunds in Kansas City. A small promoter could suffer a serious loss if he would have to return all the ticket money for a show. The WWF is a multi-million-dollar company. I remember a Formula I racing accident of 20 years ago in Italy. There was a driver killed during the race. Austrian Niki Lauda won the restarted race. But once the drivers heard about their fellow racer having passed away, Lauda and the racers who placed second and third refused to even step on the winner's podium. Within an hour after Owen Hart died, the WWF title changed hands in the very same ring. Robert Edelhauser. Vienna, Austria. Pro wrestling became my top interest in 1986 or so, thanks to exposure to both this newsletter and videotapes from promotions around the world. I was fortunate to have seen Owen Hart's career take off in Stampede Promotion, follow his career to New Japan and eventually the WWF. He was one of the performers that got me excited about this twisted form of entertainment. Like many others who grew up watching Owen Hart, part of my interest in pro wrestling went with him. We've truly lost a great talent, a great person with no vices in a business filled with morally confused people. It was refreshing to hear about the kind of person he was through The Observer, the numerous articles that followed and the testimonials of the WWF wrestlers on May 24th. The business needs more people like Owen Hart. I realize that any grief felt by myself or other wrestling fans is nothing in comparison to the family's loss. My heart goes out to Martha and the entire Hart family. Titan Sports Management, mainly Vince McMahon, have taken a lot of heat about their handling of the situation. Personally, I believe they were in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I can't imagine the level of stress that the employers and employees were in on May 23rd, so I won't second guess the decision to continue the show. I do know that, from a fan perspective, the May 24th edition of Raw was the most special wrestling show I've ever seen. I'll always remember certain out-of-character interviews that I assume were genuine. Joe Lilly. Richmond, Virginia. Response from Dave Meltzer. The company was going to take heat over the safety issue and from unrelated issues such as people waking up to the number of drug deaths and the pushing the envelope in a business where so much of the marketing is aimed at young children, no matter what decisions were made regarding continuing the show and any decisions made after that point. If they had stopped the show, all of that criticism about tasteless handling wouldn't have happened. It's not a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It can be defended as being a bad decision explained because hindsight is 20/20 and the stress of the situation didn't lead to rational thinking at that moment. The other explanations aren't as pretty, a cold monetary decision or an arrogant decision that nothing is getting in the way of the script we wrote, which can be defended by those inside wrestling but that the general public would never accept. How much media scorn did the Charlotte Speedway get for canceling that race? How much media scorn did the Astros management get for canceling the baseball game and there wasn't even a death involved there? How much media scorn did baseball get for postponing the World Series after the Bay Area earthquake? In all cases, they got a lot of praise, and neither the racing industry or Major League Baseball had to answer as to their handling of the respective situations. Don't think wrestling is being singled out because it's wrestling. In 1963, the NFL continued on with their schedule the weekend that the president was killed, and the NFL has suffered for 36 years with criticism for that decision that comes up even to this day. How much criticism would WWF have received had they honored the family's request not to air footage of the funeral? I sympathize greatly with the stress everyone in the company was under at the time. I would even sympathize to an extent even with the decision to continue on with the show as simply a wrong call by people who weren't thinking straight at the time, except by making the conscious decision not to tell the fans live about the death, and not to allow the announcers to discuss the situation during the show except for that 1-minute mention of the death. Can you imagine the same situation during the baseball, basketball, hockey or football game where the announcers were instructed not to discuss a life-threatening injury which occurred earlier in the game? It pretty much revealed their reasons is that nothing, including a death right in front of their eyes, was going to get in the way of the storylines they had scripted and the fan reaction they wanted. The reality of that mentality, which is not just a not canceling the show issue, is what is very difficult to defend and quite frankly, all issues that those trying to defend that decision have avoided addressing. Not telling the fans live was a conscious decision that would go against any normal reactions under stress to just continue the show because brain waves shut down. McMahon showing the footage, which as I said, I thought was in and of itself handled very well except if the family requested him not to, and since he'd already filmed a show opening the previous Tuesday with a hole in it to show the WWF attending the funeral en force, that he did it anyway, is not a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation nor one that can be defended due to brain waves shutting down from the instant stress. It's an I paid a lot of money and I'm damn well using that footage decision. And McMahon's letter trying to make it out like Martha Hart was the one who wasn't honest, and trying to soften the word by portraying her as a confused woman who may not have remembered saying it was okay to show the footage despite witnesses and phone calls that verify that wasn't the case is also not a damned if you do and damned if you won't situation. Think of this, a woman, very bitter, having just lost her husband, is made out by the owner of the company that it's at least in some way responsible for his death to be then portrayed as a confused woman who doesn't even remember giving the owner permission to show footage in the newspaper in her hometown when the opposite was the case. That certainly would be the straw that more than breaks the camel's back and explain Mrs. Hart's attitude toward the company. I've always been a fan of Owen Hart's. I'm not going to claim he was my favorite wrestler now, despite the fact his death has deeply saddened me for many reasons. Mostly because he was a fine upstanding family man who was doing what he had to do in order to provide for his wife and kids, including taking unnecessary risks, for the sake of keeping his standing in the company. I cringe every time I think of the sheer terror he must have experienced as he plummeted to his death. Given the fact this stunt seems to be less risky and more controlled than falling off the top of a cage through a table, we can only hope that other wrestlers, with or without families, will think twice before literally risking their life and limb for the sake of sports entertainment. I join my thoughts and prayers with those of the family and friends of Owen Hart. One of my best memories in wrestling will always be being live at Madison Square Garden with my son to see WrestleMania 10 when Owen beat Bret. It was probably the best wrestling match I ever saw. By the way, whatever happened to wrestling? Pete Theophall. Eatontown, New Jersey. No disrespect meant to either the Hart family or other subscribers, but a good deal of the blame being thrown around in the tragedy's aftermath has to fall back on Owen Hart. And I don't hear anyone acknowledging this. If his wife objected to the stunt and he didn't want to do it, and since it played no important role in any angle or storyline and he didn't like the Blue Blazer character and didn't like working for the WWF after what they did to his brother, why did he do it? The first rule of life is that you are responsible above and beyond anyone else for protecting yourself. This means not letting yourself get talked into doing dangerous things, especially if you don't need the money and would prefer to be home with your family and long for the old style of wrestling. Sure, we all know by now that Al Pacino's character in Devil's Advocate is a watered-down portrayal of Vince McMahon. But is it possible that enjoying the money and notoriety of the WWF a bit too much had something to do with him being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Otherwise, why wasn't he working a part-time Japanese schedule, wrestling a more athletic and realistic style, and spending more time home with his wife and kids? There are 1,000 reasons to wish bad karma on Vince McMahon. I'm not sure this incident is a good one. Mark Underwood, Indianapolis, Indiana. Wrestling industry. I found your observation that pro wrestling operates according to rules quite different from normal businesses very intriguing. Certainly if WCW were run according to normal business procedures, Eric Bischoff, Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan would have been fired, or at least, placed on probation for failing to deliver as advertised. For the sake of discussion, if Bischoff were to be fired, does WCW even have someone who could be placed in his senior management position? Do they, as baseball and football do, have a subordinate competent enough and ready to be promoted, or do you think it would be another Jim Herd/Bill Watts/Dusty Rhodes type of scenario? Given that Harvey Schiller is responsible for hiring the person who charts WCW's path, how do you think a replacement would be found? Could they hire an entertainment executive with no background in wrestling but with an extensive marketing savvy and contacts? If there is only a poor process in place, then perhaps Bischoff will survive to placate Hogan and Nash for an indefinite period. Do you believe that anyone at Time Warner understands, or even cares that profits are down and the future prognosis is poor? Is WCW so insignificant to Time Warner that management practices that would be immediately addressed if they owned a local 7-Eleven are allowed to continue to the quantifiable detriment of their wrestling arm? Ed Dana. Orange, California. Response from Dave Meltzer. First, you have to look at Bischoff's record from an overall perspective. He took the company over when it was grossing $30 million per year, and built it to the $200 million per year level. It'll be down this year from last year, but still probably operated close to 5 times the revenue as when Bischoff started, so he still looks good. I found that very few people who live wrestling truly understand the big picture of the business of it, so outside executives aren't going to see much past those numbers. They are probably more concerned about the declining ratings but have probably been snowed to the idea it's mainly because the WWF is so raunchy, and as a corporation they may feel that's the reality of not wanting to go into the gutter, and thus blame for the decline is diverted by that issue. Wrestling has never groomed replacements for the most part except for sons of owners. But where did Bischoff come from? He was a C-team announcer who talked his way into running the company when the position opened and turned the company around big time with some ballsy moves. There was no knowledge or background that would lead anyone to believe he would have what it takes to do this, and maybe to an extent he was just a lucky person who stole one good idea from New Japan and had the biggest bank account in the history of the industry to scour the earth and sign the best talent and got a good few-year run out of it. The odds are his replacement, if from outside of wrestling, would be another Herd, because this is not a business easily understood by outsiders. If they go to an old wrestling person, they'll get old wrestling ideas, and this business has changed so much in the past 2 years that the odds would be against that working. I believe there are people in the company, if put in the position, would make their share of mistakes, but could in the long run pull it off. But the biggest problem is that the ante of the business has been greatly raised. I don't believe you can have wrestlers writing a wrestling show in a few meetings every week and be competitive with writers working 70 hours a week writing a television show. ECW on July 13th, I went to the ECW show in Winston-Salem and it was the best night I've spent at wrestling in more than 10 years. Every match ended with a pin. There were 0 run-ins, unlike WWF and WCW. The best match I've seen in the last 5 years was Jerry Lynn versus Justin Credible. The music was absolutely blaring like a rock concert. Don't get me wrong. There was a lot of profanity, vulgarity, and I wouldn't bring a young child, but the shock kicked my ass. Your May 31st issue on Owen Hart was one of your best issues. I think it's amazing that the farther wrestling gets away from wrestling, the more people watch it. Wrestling has become a parody of itself, and I think that's sad. ECW reminds me of the IWA with Mil Mascaras. While the IWA couldn't compete with Jim Crockett Sr. here, their bi-weekly Friday night matches supplied regular cage matches and a lot of blood. I saw Mascaras wrestle Ivan Koloff, Rip Hawk, Bulldog Brower, and Luthez. Crockett ended up buying the Southern Hockey League's Winston-Salem Polar Twins to get the IWA out of town. Before reading The Observer, I thought I was the only adult who gave a shit about wrestling. I can't tell you how much I enjoy reading The Observer. You're about the only one I know who would understand the feeling of being young and seeing wrestling and not an episode of Jerry Springer. During the matches I used to have chills from the excitement like you get when watching a great match. What has happened to Nitro? It's unwatchable, like watching a really bad movie. Somebody needs to get Bischoff to dye his hair, and promote wrestlers and not basketball players. To paraphrase Yogi Berra, pro wrestling isn't like life and death. It's more important. Jeff Thornton. Greensboro, North Carolina. SmackDown. With the WWF SmackDown on broadcast, rather than cable television, it means it will be judged by the rating standards of primetime network television. What would be an excellent rating on cable is a mediocre rating for a network. I doubt the show will be anywhere near a top 10 show. How will it look to the Titan propaganda machine if the show comes in more toward the bottom 10? I believe UPN is the lowest rated of the major broadcast networks. Therefore, I suppose they'd be happy with any halfway decent rating. Every entertainment show on network television is eventually cancelled. SmackDown won't go on forever. SmackDown will be reviewed by the major TV critics like every other primetime show, and you know the reviews aren't going to be good. Of course, it will still be more of a positive than a negative for the WWF, but it may not be as big a coup as most think it will be. John Merton. Chicago, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. SmackDown will fall somewhere in the range of a 4.0 to 5.5 rating every week. It won't be a top 10 show, nor will it even challenge the NBC block on Thursday night for superiority any more than Raw actually is a challenge to ABC's lead on Monday with the NFL, despite what people who try to perpetrate myths have tried to say. But I'd be surprised if it isn't the highest rated weekly series on UPN next season, and it will definitely be one of the highest, so from that network standpoint it will be considered a huge ratings success for a network which right now is desperate for any kind of a rating. WCW. I'm vacationing and taking a break from wrestling, but the Great American Bash has forced me to compile the following list of 10 things I didn't even think WCW could accomplish. 1. Have Rey Mysterio Jr. booked in dud matches. Scott Norton, Bobby Duncombe Jr. A. Give him the Cruiserweight title and never defend it, therefore making the whole division worthless. Why doesn't Billy Kidman hold the belt? 2. Push Van Hammer again. Well, I guess they need someone to take Chris Jericho's spot. 3. Kill Ric Flair's popularity by putting him in the Psycho Ward in a totally pointless angle. Give Flair a nurse from the Psycho Ward as a valet when everyone else in the industry has a hot stripper. 4. Turn the single angle that got wrestling over again into one of the worst angles in the business. 5. Sign and bury Tank Abbott. All on the same night. 6. Chris Adams' entrance music. 7. Kill Goldberg's future. I thought that one would be really tough to do. 8. The LWO idea. 9. Ban Randy Savage from wrestling in WCW until his girlfriend wins a match. But before that match, have him wrestle regularly on television and house shows. Ban his elbow off the top rope as well, but still have him use it every night as his finisher. 10. Screw up the next superstar in wrestling, Chris Jericho. Craig Collins. Ansonia, Connecticut. Down cycle. I'm hearing more talk about an impending down cycle. It could be true. I myself have become more and more nostalgic about wrestling at the Chase, which was the weekend program here in St. Louis for years. A guy tattooing someone else's butt? Jim Ricks. St. Louis, Missouri. Dusty. Outdated reference of the decade. On the July 3rd edition of WCW Saturday Night, incidentally the first time I've even watched the show in many moons, Dusty Rhodes was talking about a tag team who were so close they stuck together like the Lennon Sisters. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. I'm sure most wrestling fans haven't. The Lennon Sisters were a singing group who used to perform on the Lawrence Welk Show during the 60s and 70s. The only reason I know that is because my grandmother was a diehard Lawrence Welk fan. Jim Ward. Birmingham, Alabama. Response from Dave Meltzer. Actually, for the audience that watches that show, it isn't that bad a reference. I vaguely remember the Lennon Sisters from my childhood, and for some reason the name The Andy Williams Show rings a bell. Because I never watched Lawrence Welk. Actually, I'd have known about them anyway because they were the nieces of Jimmy Lennon, who was and is still the greatest boxing or wrestling ring announcer that I ever saw. Hodge. Your views mirror mine and many other fans. Love the mentions about Danny Hodge. When I tell people he was the toughest wrestler I ever saw, it helps to be right and to have Dave Meltzer agree. Fred Deaton. Jackson, Tennessee. Book of Lists. Thank you very much for the kind words you had to say about my book, The Ultimate Pro Wrestling Book of Lists. The Observer has proven its power to me. I've been flooded with orders simply off your plug. My first print ad hasn't even hit the magazines and the book is already a success just from the response from Observer readers. I recently purchased a C-band satellite dish and get the America One network, which broadcasts NWA Worldwide and World Legion Wrestling. I don't know if you get a chance to see these two shows or not. NWA Worldwide is horrible. It's a complete amateur production with Bart Sawyer being the only person of note on the last show I saw. They have this fat guy doing a homosexual gimmick called Farron Fox, who is probably the worst worker I've ever seen. WLW was much better and about on par with the old AWF. The two named stars on the show I saw were Greg Valentine and Iron Sheik. Sheik looks terrible. I bet he weighs nearly 300 pounds. I booked Sheik for a show here in Alabama a few years ago, and it's sad to see just how far downhill he's gone since then. Carl Stern. Haleyville, Alabama. Wrestler of the Decade. The topic of Wrestler of the Decade has been brought up for quite some time. The top candidates people are talking about seem to be Mitsuharu Misawa, Bret Hart, and Shawn Michaels. But I think not including Ric Flair is a huge oversight. Flair has been an important figure in WCW the entire decade, and of the landscape of the wrestling industry. When WCW decided to build its company around all the various failures, it was Flair's job to bring credibility back to the title. Flair has meant a great deal in helping get others over and maintaining interest in the company. He's generally been misused throughout his career, yet he still means something when it comes to interest, drawing power and in the ring. In my opinion, he's meant more than Michaels. I can't see Michaels being considered as a top candidate. He was a main event from 1995 to 1998. His matches were top rate, but he had only a 3-year run on top. I can't see that being worthy enough. Hart was a headliner 1992 to 1998. He's a good choice. He was a key ingredient in WWF drifting away from the cartoon formula. As a drawing card he was average. His matches were decent but usually not spectacular. He saved himself for the big matches. I think the clear winner is Misawa. He has been on top since the late 80s. His matches against Jumbo Tsuruta were awesome for their time and they drew. He stayed on top the entire decade. His matches have been top-notch. Granted, he's now slowing down, but who wouldn't wrestling such a hard, physically taxing style? Currently he picks his spots and saves himself for the big shows. Flair, Hart, Masahiro Chono and other headliners have done the same with less criticism for it. And Misawa's had more Match of the Year candidates than most wrestlers. I hope the WWF continues the Super Astro show. The show contains top-quality wrestling with mostly clean finishes. The booking is simple, but it gets the storylines over. The booking is similar to New Japan or EMLL. The TV show is still enjoyable even with a skeleton crew. Papi Chulo has improved a ton. He still does a ton of high spots, but he now displays decent heel charisma. He looks much better as a tag team wrestler. Jesus Castillo is much better in his heel role. He's the best heel in the division. Apollo Dantes still sucks. Taka Michinoku and Shoichi Funaki have been a great asset of late. I'm amazing they are being used so decently. Super Crazy has been misused. I don't know why he uses the mask. He's one of the few luchadores whose lack of a mask doesn't inhibit his personality. He's colorless with the mask. His matches have the potential to be a lot better if they gave him longer matches and better opponents. Losing Leo Del Santo, Negro Casas, Pantera, Felino, Ray Bucanero and Armando Fernandez have hurt the show. But even with the current crew, they put out a good product. Eric Bimbin. Far Rockaway, New York. Supercards and Tournaments. I just wanted to thank you for the review of my website, Wrestling Supercards and Tournaments. I've received numerous emails from people with additions and corrections who said they had read about it in the Observer. At times I've considered giving a small description of each match or tournament, but have decided against it due to space restrictions and not wanting to interject my opinion. I'll be adding several hundred cards and tournaments from the old territories to the list over the summer. Jason Campbell. Columbus, Ohio. J. Crown. I was greatly interested in the J. Crown titles when Ultimo Dragon held them. I've read conflicting articles relating to what titles made up the J. Crown and how the unification tournament came about. Also, what happened to it? I understand it was dissolved and most of the titles have passed to other organizations. Jeff Nettleton. Springfield, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Keiichi Yamada, Jushin Liger, as the booker of the New Japan Junior Heavyweight Division, put the J. Crown tournament together. They ran an all-junior heavyweight show at Budokan Hall with wrestlers from many different promotions, all defending their titles, ending with a scene of all the champs together in the ring putting their belts on the ground. They wound up with a tournament from August 2nd through the 5th, 1996 at Sumo Hall. The 8 original contestants and their titles were Great Sasuke, IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion, Masayoshi Motegi, NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, Ultimo Dragon, War International Junior Heavyweight Champion, Liger, British Commonwealth Junior Heavyweight Champion, Shinjiro Otani, Uwa Light Heavyweight Champion, which was actually a bogus version, as the title he wound up with was originally something else and the belt had something else on it, Negro Casas, NWA Welterweight Champion, El Samurai, WWF Light Heavyweight Champion, which wasn't recognized by the WWF but historically does date back to the 80s when WWF President Hisashi Shinma came up with the belt for use in New Japan and UWA in Mexico, and Gran Hamada, WWA Junior Light Heavyweight Champion. Sasuke won the original tournament, dropped the title to Dragon, who at one point held 10 different titles because he also held the WCW Cruiserweight and NWA Middleweight belts, who then lost the 8 to Liger. The J Crown pretty well fell apart at this point. Liger dropped 1 or 2 of the belts back in the ring to wrestlers from the original promotions, and the rest New Japan just vacated and sent back to the original owners. Over 40. After watching Thunder on June 3rd, one of Larry Zbyszko's comments stuck with me. During the Chris Benoit vs. Ric Flair main event, Larry the Legend said that most wrestlers don't even reach their prime until they turn 40. That comment showed the public everything that's wrong with WCW. Not only do they employ all the old guys and only push all the old guys, but now it's their badge of honor. Meanwhile, how many 40-year-old main eventers does the WWF employ? None, unless you count when Vince McMahon wrestles. Of course, the way Mick Foley and Undertaker are breaking down, they may be completely out of the business by the time they are 40. Then again, they could just sign with WCW when their current contracts expire and make $2 million a year wrestling Diamond Dallas Page and Sting. Jeffrey Cohen. Flushing, New York. Michaels. I think the reason I broke up with my girlfriend was because she wasn't a Shawn Michaels fan. You've got to love Shawn Michaels. Eric Smith. Dyersburg, Tennessee. Response from Dave Meltzer. That isn't the dumbest reason I've ever heard for a break-up, but it does make the list. World title. Real sports doesn't rehearse and they'll question a guy while the sweat in his cup is slowly rotting his balls off. Spontaneous answers are perfect in sports. Reports keep hoping somebody will say something stupid, like what Bobby Hull said about Hitler or some Patriot lineman grossing out a female reporter. They wait for some guy to say the wrong thing. There is no need for spontaneity in pro wrestling now that Sam Mushnick and Giant Baba are gone. There is no need to make it seem to be a real sport or, at the very least, make your world championship have some sort of credibility and lend dignity to the organization. Jack Briscoe and Bruno Sammartino exuded class as world champions when I came back to wrestling in 1973. It made no sense to me then when the semi-marks would say how all the prelim matches were fake but the world title matches were for real. For some reason, I could almost accept that. Sam Mushnick and Vince Sr. sold people 100% on their titles. That was okay back then. There is no need to do this realism act in 1999. Quit, Pat. Rehearsed interviews are in. The storyline is just too important in modern wrestling to botch it up. Michael Abbey. Fairfield, Maine. Ventura. All the hoopla over Jesse Ventura winning the governorship of Minnesota got me to thinking about the great angles from the 70s in Portland. He did begin here as the Great Ventura, and later changed to Jesse Ventura, although I don't remember him starting out with a hood. He came in as the protege of Bull Ramos. Bull did all the talking for him in the beginning. Buddy Rose came from Texas, where he was jobber Paul Pershman, and soon befriended Ventura. In leading to the big breakup angle, Ventura was using his full Nelson. Every muscular wrestler in Portland used he full Nelson as a finisher, most notably Jimmy Snuka and Billy Jack Haynes, and refused to let go. After several wrestlers were unable to break it, Ramos lit a match and burned him to make him release the hold. Ramos and Ventura split up in a tag match against Snuka and Dutch Savage, with Ramos turning face. After many months of teaming, Rose and Ventura lost the Northwest Tag titles to Lonnie Main and Leigh Thornton after Rose accidentally came off the top rope with a knee drop on Ventura's arm. Ventura went to Hawaii to recuperate while Rose stayed and insisted there were no problems between the two. 6 weeks later, Rose said he had signed a rematch for the tag titles as Ventura had recovered and would be back the next week. The night of the match, Rose was in the crow's nest hyping the match, saying he knew Ventura was in the building but hadn't had a chance to talk with him yet. Ventura came out and began talking about how he came back to get at one person and one person only. As Rose urged him on, Ventura said that everyone probably thought he was after Main or Thornton. He said he would let everyone in on who his target was, and suddenly slugged Rose. He pounded on him and Rose juiced big time. Rose and Ventura waged a lengthy big money program for this small territory. Ventura then left and went on to bigger and better things. Speaking of Maine, it sure would have been nice to have the Observer in 1978 after he died in the car accident. Could you provide a brief thumbnail sketch of what you would have written about him? Greg Anderson. Kelso, Washington. Response from Dave Meltzer. I remember Lonnie Maine, who was better known in most of the country as Moondog Maine, vividly. He started in Portland in the mid-60s as a big local kid with Tony Bourne as his tag partner and worked a lot in Hawaii as a headliner, as Mad Dog Maine. He went to the WWF for a program with Pedro Morales where the name Moondog Maine came from, and then started his biggest run as U.S. champion in San Francisco, headlining the Cow Palace as a heel for a long successful run against the likes of Pat Patterson and Peter Maivia. He was probably the most believable crazy man I ever saw, probably because he was a little bit out of his mind. He'd eat goldfish and glass on TV, and his chest was scarred up from raking the glass across it and opening up sick cuts before eating the glass to prove the glass was real. He was a good worker by those standards, more a good bump taker for a fat guy as he was probably only 5'10" and probably weighed 260 legit. I'd say as a worker his style was a 70s version of Cactus Jack, although the ante is upped and he never did the stuff Jack did, but they were similar in physique and in ring style, and he was a real good interview too, doing the crazy man gimmick. At the time of his death, he was a babyface in San Francisco and a heel in Los Angeles, and we got both TV shows in this market at the same time, and you can imagine in those days how weird that was, and held the U.S. title and America's title simultaneously, which I believe would have made him the only man in history to do so. I remember the death pretty vividly as I was in high school at the time, and it was a pretty big deal. He wrestled on a Sunday night in Bakersfield, which I believe was August 13, 1978, and was driving to Sacramento for a TV taping the next night. He fell asleep at the wheel on Highway 5 and the car crossed the embankment and crashed head-on with another car, and everyone in both cars were killed. It was a bad deal because he was the top face in the local promotion and everyone pretty well knew it was his fault, as he had passed out at the wheel. Made more tragic because he took innocent people's lives. At the time they did the taping, they were building a Maine vs. Buddy Rose match at the Cow Palace on August 18th. These dates could be off by a day or two but are pretty close, and Maine was supposed to be wrestling on TV and doing an interview. Word never made it to the studio why he wasn't there. They did the show and were advertising him in the TV main event. When the time came for his match, they actually had announcer Hank Renner say that Maine was there. He was so mad at Rose he refused to wrestle his match or do an interview or some nonsense. The word actually didn't make the media of Maine dying until August 16th, and it really wasn't covered as that big of a story, even though literally everyone who lived in the area knew who he was, although he was even more of a household name in Oregon than California. So after he died and we all knew it, we watched the TV to see how it would be handled 2 days later, and they were pretending he was there and would come out for his TV main event, and when he didn't, they talked about how mad he was, and spent the entire show building up Maine versus Rose for the title at the Cow Palace tonight. Finally, at the end of the show they put in this 30 seconds inset which said Maine had died in a car accident and, more importantly, that the main event would change. In those days athletic commissions were really strict about false advertising, as if a main eventer didn't appear, you had to make the announcements and offer refunds, and the promoter could be in real hot water if he didn't get the word out about the change in the main event as soon as he knew, which led to some very colorful stories over the years. The next week on TV, they had 3 or 4 interviews mentioning his death in vague circumstances, including Rose doing a totally out of character interview praising him, and his name was never spoken again. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.